alarmed, though your sister does play so well. There is a stubbornness about me that never can bear to be frightened at the will of others. My courage always rises with every attempt to intimidate me. Oh, word of fear, unpleasing to our married dear, unpleasing to our married dear.
Audio Theatre presents Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. Abridged and adapted by M. Allen Erickson. Directed by Eileen Skevington.
It is a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. However little known the feelings or views of such a man may be on his first entering a neighbourhood, this truth is so well fixed in the minds of the surrounding families that he is considered as the rightful property of some one or other of their daughters. Mrs. Bennet of Longbourn had just received news of such an eligible arrival to the area and felt compelled to impart this exciting development to her husband, Mr. Bennet.
My dear Mr. Bennet, have you heard that Netherfield Park is let at last?
No.
But it is, for Mrs. Long has just been here and she told me all about it.
Mm-hmm.
But do you not want to know who has taken it?
You want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it.
Why, my dear, you must know. Mrs. Long says that Netherfield is taken by a young man of large fortune from the north of England, that he came down on Monday in a chaise and four to see the place, and was so much delighted with it that he agreed with Mr. Morris immediately that he is to take possession before Michaelmas, and some of his servants are to be in the house by the end of next week.
What is his name?
Bingley.
Is he married or single?
Oh, single, my dear, to be sure. A single man of large fortune. 4,000 or 5,000 a year. Oh, what a fine thing for our girls.
How so? How can it affect them?
My dear Mr. Bennet, how can you be so tiresome? You must know that I am thinking of his marrying one of them.
Oh, is that his design in settling here?
Design nonsense. How can you talk so? But it is very likely he may fall in love with one of them, and therefore you must visit him as soon as he comes.
I see no occasion for that. You and the girls may go, or you may send them by themselves, which perhaps will be still better, for as you are as handsome as any of them, Mr. Bingley might like you the best of the party.
My dear, you flatter me. I certainly have had my share of beauty, but I do not pretend to be anything extraordinary now. When a woman has 5 grown-up daughters, she ought to give over thinking of her own beauty.
In such cases, a woman has not often much beauty to think of.
But, my dear, you must indeed go and see Mr. Bingley when he comes into the neighbourhood.
It's more than I engage for, I assure you.
But consider your daughters. Only think what an establishment it would be for one of them. Sir William and Lady Lucas are determined to go, merely on that account, for in general, you know, they visit no newcomers. Indeed, you must go, for it will be impossible for us to visit him if you do not.
You are over-scrupulous, surely. I dare say Mr. Bingley will be very glad to see you, and I will send a few lines by you to assure him of my hearty consent to his marrying whichever he chooses of the girls, though I must throw in a good word for my little Lizzie.
I desire you will do no such thing. Lizzie is not a bit better than the others, and I am sure she is not half so handsome as Jane, nor half so good-humoured as Lydia. But you are always giving her the preference.
They have none of them much to recommend them. They're all silly and ignorant like other girls. But Lizzie has something more of quickness than her sisters.
Mr. Bennet, how can you abuse your own children in such a way? You take delight in vexing me. You have no compassion on my poor nerves.
Oh, you mistake me, my dear. I have a high respect for your nerves. They are my old friends. I have heard you mention them with consideration these 20 years at least.
Ah, you do not know what I suffer.
But I hope you will get over it and live to see many young men of 4,000 a year come into the neighbourhood.
It will be no use to us if 20 such should come. since you will not visit them?
Oh, depend upon it, my dear, that when there are 20, I will visit them all.
Mr. Bennet was in fact among the earliest of those who waited on Mr. Bingley. He had always intended to visit him, though to the last always assuring his wife that he should not go. Until the evening after the visit was paid, she had no knowledge of it. It was then disclosed in the following manner. Observing his second daughter, Elizabeth Bennet, or Lizzie as he was wont to name her, busy trimming a hat, he suddenly addressed her.
I hope Mr. Bingley will like it, Lizzie.
We are not in a way to know what Mr. Bingley likes, since we are not to visit.
But you forget, Mamma, that we shall meet him at the assemblies, and Mrs. Long has promised to introduce him.
I do not believe Mrs. Long will do any such thing. She has 2 nieces of her own. She is a selfish, hypocritical woman, and I have no opinion of her.
No more have I, and I am glad to find that you do not depend on her serving you.
When is your next ball to be, Lizzie?
Tomorrow fortnight.
Aye, so it is. And Mrs. Long does not come back till the day before. So it will be impossible for her to introduce Mr. Bingley, for she will not know him herself.
Then, my dear, you may have the advantage of your friend and introduce Mr. Bingley to her.
Impossible, Mr. Bennet, impossible. When I am not acquainted with him myself. How can you be so teasing?
I honour your circumspection. A fortnight's acquaintance is certainly very little. One cannot know what a man really is by the end of a fortnight. But if we do not venture, somebody else will. And after all, Mrs. Long and her nieces must stand their chance. And therefore, as she will think it an act of kindness if you decline the office, I will take it on myself.
Nonsense! Nonsense!
What can be the meaning of that emphatic exclamation? Do you consider the forms of introduction and the stress that is laid on them as nonsense? I cannot quite agree with you there.
I am sick of Mr. Bingley.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. But why did you not tell me so before? If I had known as much this morning, I certainly would not have called on him. It's very unlucky, but as I have actually paid the visit, we cannot escape the acquaintance now.
How good it was in you, my dear Mr. Bennet. But I knew I should persuade you at last. I was sure you loved your girls too well to neglect such an acquaintance. Oh, how pleased I am. And it is such a good joke, too, that you should have gone this morning and never said a word about it till now. What an excellent father you have, girls. I do not know how you will ever make him amends for his kindness, or me either, for that matter. At our time of life, it is not so pleasant, I can tell you, to be making new acquaintances every day. But for your sakes, we would do anything.
To be fond of dancing was a certain step towards falling in love, and very lively hopes of Mr. Bingley's heart were entertained. A report soon followed that Mr. Bingley was to bring 12 ladies and 7 gentlemen with him to the assembly. But when the party entered the assembly room, it consisted of only 5 altogether. Mr. Bingley, his 2 sisters, the husband of the eldest sister, and another young man. Mr. Bingley was good-looking and gentlemanlike. His brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, merely looked the gentleman, but his friend, Mr. Darcy, soon drew the attention of the room by his fine, tall person, handsome features, noble mien, and the report, which was in general circulation within 5 minutes after his entrance, of his having 10,000 a year. Mr. Bingley soon made himself acquainted with all the principal people in the room. He was lively and unreserved, and danced every dance. What a contrast between him and his friend. Mr. Darcy danced only once with Mrs. Hurst, Mr. Bingley's eldest sister, and with the younger Miss Bingley. declined being introduced to any other lady, and spent the rest of the evening in walking about the room, speaking occasionally to one of his own party. The evening altogether passed off pleasantly to the whole family. Mrs. Bennet had seen Jane, her eldest daughter, much admired by the Netherfield party. Mr. Bingley had danced with her twice, and she had been distinguished by her sisters. Jane was as much gratified by this as her mother could be, although in a quieter way. When Jane and Elizabeth were alone, the former, who had been cautious in her praise of Mr. Bingley before, expressed to her sister how very much she admired him.
Mr. Bingley is just what a young man ought to be. Sensible, good-humoured, lively, and I never saw such happy manners, so much at ease, with such perfect good breeding.
He is also handsome, which a young man ought likewise to be, if he possibly can. His character is thereby complete.
I was very much flattered by his asking me to dance a second time. I did not expect such a compliment.
Did not you? I did for you. But that is one great difference between us. Compliments always take you by surprise, and me never. Well, what could be more natural than his asking you again? He could not help seeing that you were about 5 times as pretty as every other woman in the room. No thanks to his gallantry for that. Well, he certainly is very agreeable, and I give you leave to like him. You have liked many a stupider person.
Dear Lizzie.
Oh, you are a great deal too apt, you know, to like people in general. You never see a fault in anybody. All the world are good and agreeable in your eyes. I never heard you speak ill of a human being in my life.
I would not wish to be hasty in censuring anyone, but I always speak what I think.
I know you do, and it is that which makes the wonder. With your good sense, to be so honestly blind to the follies and nonsense of others. Affectation of candour is common enough, one meets it everywhere, but to be candid without ostentation or design, to take the good of everybody's character and make it still better and say nothing of the bad, belongs to you alone. And so, you like this man's sisters too, do you? Their manners are not equal to his.
Certainly not at first, but they are very pleasing women when you converse with them. Miss Bingley is to live with her brother and keep his house, and I am much mistaken if we shall not find a very charming neighbour in her.
Elizabeth listened in silence, but was not convinced. Miss Bingley's and Mrs. Hurst's behaviour at the assembly had not been calculated to please in general, and with more quickness of observation and less pliancy of temper than her sister, and with a judgment too unassailed by any attention to herself, she was very little disposed to approve them. Within a short walk of Longbourn lived the Lucas family, with whom the Bennets were particularly intimate. Sir William Lucas had been formerly in trade in Meryton, where he had made a tolerable fortune and risen to the honour of knighthood by an address to the king during his mayoralty. Lady Lucas was a very good kind of woman, not too clever to be a valuable neighbour to Mrs. Bennet. They had several children. Charlotte, the eldest of them, a sensible, intelligent young woman, about 27, was Elizabeth's intimate friend. That the Miss Lucases and the Miss Bennets should meet to talk over a ball was absolutely necessary, and the morning after the assembly brought Charlotte Lucas to Longbourn to hear and to communicate.
You began the evening well, Charlotte. You were Mr. Bingley's first choice.
Yes, but he seemed to like his second choice better.
Oh, you mean Jane, I suppose, because he danced with her twice. To be sure, that did seem as if he admired her. Indeed, I rather believe he did. I heard something about it, but I hardly know what.
Perhaps you mean what I overheard him say about Jane. Did I not mention it to you? That there were a great many pretty women in the room, and which he thought the prettiest? Oh, the eldest Miss Bennet, without a doubt. There cannot be two opinions on that point.
Upon my word. Well, that was very decided indeed. That does seem as if... But, however, it may all come to nothing, you know.
My overhearings were more to the purpose than yours, Eliza. Mr. Darcy is not so well worth listening to as his friend, is he? Poor Eliza. To be only just tolerable.
I beg you would not put it into Lizzie's head to be vexed by his ill treatment, for he is such a disagreeable man that it would be quite a misfortune to be liked by him. Mrs. Long told me last night that he sat close to her for half an hour without once opening his lips.
Are you quite sure, ma'am? Is there not a little mistake? I certainly saw Mr. Darcy speaking to her.
Aye, because she asked him at last how he liked Netherfield, and he could not help answering her. But she said he seemed very angry at being spoken to.
Miss Bingley told me that he never speaks much unless amongst his intimate acquaintances. With them he is remarkably agreeable.
I do not believe a word of it, my dear. If he had been so very agreeable, he would have talked to Mrs. Long. But I can guess how it was. Everybody says that he is ate up with pride, and I dare say he had heard somehow that Mrs. Long does not keep a carriage, and had come to the ball in a hack chaise.
I do not mind his not talking to Mrs. Long, but I wish he had danced with Eliza.
Another time, Lizzie. I would not dance with him if I were you.
I believe, ma'am, I may safely promise you never to dance with him.
His pride does not offend me so much as pride often does, because there is an excuse for it. One cannot wonder that so very fine a young man, with family, fortune, everything in his favour, should think highly of himself. If I may so express it, he has a right to be proud.
That is very true, and I could easily forgive his pride if he had not mortified mine.
The ladies of Longbourn soon waited on those of Netherfield. The visit was returned in due form. Jane Bennet's pleasing manners grew on the goodwill of Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, and though Mrs. Bennet was found to be intolerable, and the younger sisters not worth speaking to, a wish of being better acquainted with them was expressed towards the two eldest. By Jane this attention was received with the greatest pleasure, but Elizabeth still saw superciliousness in their treatment of everybody. She was taken aback on finding Mr. Darcy attending to her conversation with others. His so doing drew her notice at a large party at Sir William Lucas one evening.
Charlotte, what does Mr. Darcy mean by listening to my conversation with Colonel Forster?
That is a question which Mr. Darcy only can answer.
But if he does it any more, I shall certainly let him know that I can see what he is about. He has a very satirical eye, and if I do not begin by being impertinent myself, I shall soon grow afraid of him.
What a charming amusement for young people music and dancing is, Mr. Darcy. There's nothing like it after all. I consider it as one of the first refinements of polished societies.
Certainly, sir, and it has the advantage also of being in vogue amongst the less polished societies of the world. Every savage can dance.
Your friend performed delightfully. And I doubt not that you are an adept in the science yourself, Mr. Darcy.
You saw me dance at Meryton, I believe, sir.
Yes, indeed, and received no inconsiderable pleasure from the sight. Do you often dance at St. James's?
Never, sir.
Do you not think it would be a proper compliment to the place?
It is a compliment which I never pay to any place if I can avoid it.
You have a house in town, I conclude.
I do.
I had once some thoughts of fixing in town myself, for I'm fond of superior society, but I didn't feel quite certain that the air of London would agree with Lady Lucas. Well, Miss Eliza, what lovely music. My dear Miss Eliza, why are you not dancing? Mr. Darcy, you must allow me to present this young lady to you as a very desirable partner. You cannot refuse to dance, I'm sure, when so much beauty is before you.
Indeed, sir. I have not the least intention of dancing. I entreat you not to suppose that I moved this way in order to beg for a partner.
You excel so much in the dance, Miss Eliza, that it's cruel to deny me the happiness of seeing you. And though this gentleman dislikes the amusement in general, he can have no objection, I'm sure, to oblige us for 1/2 hour.
Mr. Darcy is all politeness.
He is indeed. But considering the inducement, my dear Miss Eliza, we cannot wonder at his complaisance, for who would object to such a partner? Ah, Miss Bingley.
I can guess the subject of your reverie.
I should imagine not, Miss Bingley.
Mr. Darcy, you are considering how insupportable it would be to pass many evenings in this manner, in such society. and indeed I am quite of your opinion. I was never more annoyed. The insipidity and yet the noise, the nothingness and yet the self-importance of all these people. What would I give to hear your strictures on them?
Your conjecture is totally wrong, I assure you, Miss Bingley. My mind was more agreeably engaged.
One morning at the Bennet residence, a footman entered to present a note for Miss Jane Bennet. It came from Netherfield, and the servant waited for an answer.
Well, Jane, who is it from? What is it about? What does he say? Well, Jane, make haste and tell us. Make haste, my love.
It is from Miss Bingley. My dear friend, if you are not so compassionate as to dine today with Louisa and me, we shall be in danger of hating each other for the rest of our lives, for a whole day's tete-a-tete between two women can never end without a quarrel. Come as soon as you can on the receipt of this. My brother and the gentleman are to dine with the officers. Yours ever, Caroline Bingley.
Dining out? Oh, that's very unlucky.
Can I have the carriage?
No, Jane, my dear, you had better go on horseback, because it seems likely to rain, and then you must stay all night.
That would be a good scheme, if you were sure they would not offer to send her home.
Oh, but the gentleman will have Mr. Bingley's chaise to go to Meryton, and the Hursts have no horses to theirs.
I had much better go in the coach.
But, my dear, your father cannot spare the horses, I am sure. They are wanted in the farm, Mr. Bennet, are not they?
They are wanted in the farm much oftener than I can get them.
But if you have got them today, my mother's purposes will be answered.
Jane was obliged to go on horseback, and her mother attended her to the door with many cheerful prognostics of a bad day. Jane had not been gone long before indeed it rained hard. The rain continued the whole evening without intermission. Jane certainly could not come back. Next morning, a servant from Netherfield brought the following note to Longbourn from Jane.
My dearest Lizzie, I find myself unwell this morning, which I suppose is to be imputed to my getting wet through yesterday. My kind friends will not hear of my returning home till I am better. They insist also on my seeing Mr. Jones. Therefore, do not be alarmed if you should hear of his having been to me. And excepting a sore throat and headache, there is not much the matter with me. Yours, etc.
Well, my dear Mrs. Bennet, if your daughter should have a dangerous fit of illness, if she should die, it would be a comfort to know that it was all in pursuit of Mr. Bingley and under your orders.
Oh, I am not at all afraid of her dying. People do not die of little trifling colds. She will be taken good care of. As long as she stays there, it is all very well. I would go and see her if I could have the carriage.
Carriage or no carriage, I will go to her.
How can you be so silly as to think of such a thing in all this dirt? You will not be fit to be seen when you get there.
I shall be very fit to see Jane, which is all I want.
Is this a hint to me, Lizzie, to send for the horses?
No, indeed. I do not wish to avoid the walk. The distance is nothing when one has a motive. Only 3 miles. I shall be back by dinner.
At Netherfield, Elizabeth was shown into the breakfast parlour, where all but Jane were assembled, and where her appearance created a deal of surprise. She was received, however, very politely. Her inquiries after her sister were not very favourably answered. Miss Bennet had slept ill, and though up was very feverish, and not well enough to leave her room. When the clock struck 3, Elizabeth felt that she must go, and very unwillingly said so. But when Jane testified concern in parting with her, Miss Bingley invited Elizabeth to remain at Netherfield for the present. Elizabeth most thankfully accepted, and a servant was dispatched to Longbourn to acquaint the family with the stay and bring back a supply of clothes. At 6:30, Elizabeth was summoned to dinner, which she was glad to escape from and return to Jane. No sooner had she left the room than Mr. Bingley's 2 sisters, Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley, commented.
Miss Elizabeth has nothing to recommend her but being an excellent walker. I shall never forget her appearance this morning. She really looked almost wild.
She did indeed, Louisa. I could hardly keep my countenance. Very nonsensical to come at all. Why must she be scampering about the country because her sister had a cold? Her hair so untidy, so blousy.
Yes, and her petticoat. I hope you saw her petticoat. 6 inches deep in mud, I am absolutely certain. And the gown, which had been let down to hide it, not doing its office. Did you notice?
Your picture may be very exact, Louisa, but this was all lost upon me. I thought Miss Elizabeth Bennet looked remarkably well when she came into the room this morning. Her dirty petticoat quite escaped my notice.
You observed it, Mr. Darcy, I am sure. And I'm inclined to think you would not wish to see your sister make such an exhibition.
Certainly not.
To walk 3 miles, or 4 miles, or 5 miles, or whatever it is, above her ankles in dirt and alone, quite alone. What could she mean by it? It seems to me to show an abominable sort of conceited independence, a most country town indifference to decorum.
It shows an affection for her sister that is very pleasing.
I'm afraid, Mr. Darcy, that this adventure has rather affected your admiration of her fine eyes.
Not at all. They were brightened by the exercise.
I have an excessive regard for Jane Bennet. Now, she is really a very sweet girl, and I wish with all my heart she were well settled. But with such a father and mother, and such low connections, I am afraid there is no chance of it.
I think I have heard you say that their uncle is an attorney in Meryton.
Yes, and they have another who lives somewhere near Cheapside. Oh, dear.
That is capital.
If they had uncles enough to fill all Cheapside, it would not make them one jot less agreeable.
But it must materially lessen their chance of marrying men of any consideration in the world.
Elizabeth sat with her sister until quite late in the evening. Only when she saw her comfortably asleep did she join the party in the living room. She settled with a book. Mr. Bingley's brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, seemed to find this unusual.
Do you prefer reading to cards? Oh, that is rather singular.
Miss Eliza Bennet despises cards. She is a great reader and has no pleasure in anything else.
I deserve neither such praise nor such censure. I am not a great reader, and I have pleasure in many things.
In nursing your sister, I am sure you have pleasure, and I hope it will soon be increased by seeing her quite well.
Thank you, Mr. Bingley. Do you mind if I take a look at these books?
I wish my collection were larger, for your benefit and my own credit. But I am an idle fellow, and though I have not many, I have more than I ever look into.
I am astonished that my father should have left so small a collection of books. What a delightful library you have at Pemberley, Mr. Darcy.
It ought to be good. It has been the work of many generations.
And then you have added so much to it yourself.
I cannot comprehend the neglect of a family library in such days as these.
Neglect? I'm sure you neglect nothing that can add to the beauties of that noble place. Charles, when you build your house, I wish it may be half as delightful as Pemberley.
I wish it may.
But I would really advise you to make your purchase in that neighbourhood and take Pemberley for a kind of model. There is not a finer county in England than Derbyshire.
With all my heart. I will buy Pemberley itself if Darcy will sell it.
I am talking of possibilities, Charles.
Upon my word, Caroline, I should think it more possible to get Pemberley by purchase than by imitation.
Is Miss Darcy much grown since the spring? Will she be as tall as I am?
I think she will. She is now about Miss Elizabeth Bennet's height, or rather taller.
How I long to see her again. I never met with anybody who delighted me so much. Such a countenance, such manners, and so extremely accomplished for her age. Her performance on the pianoforte is exquisite.
It is amazing to me how young ladies can have patience to be so very accomplished as they all are.
All young ladies accomplished? My dear Charles, what do you mean?
Yes, all of them, I think. They all paint tables, cover screens and net purses. I scarcely know anyone who cannot do all this, and I am sure I never heard a young lady spoken of for the first time without being informed that she was very accomplished.
Your list of the common extent of accomplishments has too much truth. The word is applied to many a woman who deserves it no otherwise than by netting a purse or covering a screen. But I am very far from agreeing with you in your estimation of ladies in general. I cannot boast of knowing more than half a dozen in the whole range of my acquaintance that are really accomplished.
Nor I'm sure.
Then you must comprehend a great deal in your idea of an accomplished woman, Mr. Darcy.
Yes, I do comprehend a great deal in it.
Oh, certainly. No one can be really accomplished who does not greatly surpass what is usually met with. A woman must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages to deserve the word. And besides all this, she must possess a certain something in her air and manner of walking, the tone of her voice, her address and expressions, or the word will be but half deserved.
All this she must possess, and to all this she must yet add something more substantial in the improvement of her mind by extensive reading.
I am no longer surprised at your knowing only 6 accomplished women. I rather wonder now at your knowing any.
Are you so severe upon your own sex as to doubt the possibility of all this?
I never saw such a woman. I never saw such capacity and taste and application and elegance as you describe united.
How can you say such a thing? Oh.
Well, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to check on Jane.
Miss Bingley was not so entirely satisfied with this reply as to continue the subject. Elizabeth joined them again later to say that Jane was worse. Mr. Bingley urged Mr. Jones being sent for immediately, while his sisters recommended an express to town for one of the most eminent physicians. It was settled that Mr. Jones should be sent for early in the morning if Miss Bennet were not decidedly better. Finding Jane tolerably well the next morning, Elizabeth nonetheless requested to have a note sent to Longbourn desiring her mother to visit Jane and form her own judgment of her situation. Mrs. Bennet arrived with her 2 youngest daughters soon after breakfast, and though finding Jane in no immediate danger, had no wish of her recovering immediately, and would not listen to her daughter's proposal of being carried home, and neither did the apothecary think she should be moved. When Mr. Bingley met them with hopes that they had not found Miss Bennet worse than expected.
Indeed I have, sir. She is a great too ill to be moved. Mr. Jones says we must not think of moving her. We must trespass a little longer on your kindness.
Removed? It must not be thought of. My sister, I am sure, will not hear of her removal.
You may depend upon it, madam, that Miss Bennet shall receive every possible attention while she remains with us.
Oh, thank you. I am sure if it was not for such good friends, I do not know what would become of her. For she is very ill indeed, and suffers a vast deal, though with the greatest patience in the world, which is always the way with her, for she has, without exception, the sweetest temper I ever met with. I often tell my other girls they are nothing to her. You have a sweet room here, Mr. Bingley, and a charming prospect over that gravel walk. I do not know a place in the country that is equal to Netherfield. You will not think of quitting it in a hurry, I hope, though you have but a short lease.
Whatever I do is done in a hurry, and therefore if I should resolve to quit Netherfield, I should probably be off in 5 minutes. At present, however, I consider myself as quite fixed here.
That is exactly what I should have supposed of you.
You begin to comprehend me, do you?
Oh, yes, I understand you perfectly.
I wish I might take this for a compliment, but to be so easily seen through, I'm afraid, is pitiful.
That is as it happens. It does not necessarily follow that a deep, intricate character is more or less estimable than such a one as yours.
Lizzie, remember where you are, and do not run on in the wild manner that you are suffered to do at home.
I did not know before that you were a studier of character. It must be an amusing study.
Yes, but intricate characters are the most amusing. They have at least that advantage.
The country can in general supply but few subjects for such a study. In a country neighbourhood you move in a very confined and unvarying society.
But people themselves alter so much.
I assure you there is quite as much of that going on in the country as in town. I cannot see that London has any great advantage over the country, for my part, except the shops and public places. The country is a vast deal pleasanter, is it not, Mr. Bingley?
When I am in the country, I never wish to leave it. And when I am in town, it is pretty much the same. They have each their advantages, and I can be equally happy in either.
Aye, that is because you have the right disposition. But that gentleman seemed to think the country was nothing at all.
Oh, indeed, Mamma, you are mistaken. You quite mistook Mr. Darcy. He only meant that there were not such a variety of people to be met with in the country as in the town, which you must acknowledge to be true.
Certainly, my dear, nobody said there were. But as to not meeting with many people in this neighbourhood, I believe there are few neighbourhoods larger. I know we dine with 24 families.
Mamma, pray, did Charlotte Lucas call at Longbourn yesterday?
Yes, indeed, she called with her father. What an agreeable man Sir William is, Mr. Bingley, is not he? So much the man of fashion, so genteel and so easy. He has always something to say to everybody. That's my idea of good breeding, and those persons who fancy themselves very important and never open their mouths quite mistake the matter.
Did Charlotte dine with you?
No, she would go home. I fancy she was wanted about the mince pies. For my part, Mr. Bingley, I always keep servants that can do their own work. My daughters are brought up differently. But everybody is to judge for themselves, and the Lucases are a very good sort of girls, I assure you. It is a pity that they are not handsome. Not that I think Charlotte is so very plain, but then she is our particular friend.
She seems a very pleasant young woman.
Oh, dear, yes. But you must own she is very plain. Lady Lucas herself has often said so, and envied me Jane's beauty. I do not like to boast of my Jane, but to be sure, one does not often see anybody better looking. It is what everybody says. I do not trust to my own partiality. When she was only 15, there was a gentleman at my brother Gardiner's in town so much in love with her that my sister-in-law was sure he would make her an offer before we came away. But, however, he did not. Perhaps he thought her too young. However, he wrote some verses on her, and very pretty they were.
And so ended his affection. There has been many a one, I fancy, overcome in the same way. I wonder who first discovered the efficacy of poetry in driving away love.
I have been used to consider poetry as the food of love.
Of a fine, stout, healthy love it may. Everything nourishes what is strong already. But if it be only a light, thin sort of inclination, I am convinced that one good sonnet will starve it entirely away.
Conversation seemed to have dried up, and the group dispersed, but not before the ladies had exerted a promise from Mr. Bingley that he would hold a ball as discussed earlier, as soon as Jane Bennet was well enough. In the evening, Jane was still not well enough to leave her room. Elizabeth joined her hosts in the drawing-room, where Mr. Darcy was writing a letter assisted by Miss Bingley. Elizabeth took up some needlework and attended to what passed between Darcy and his companion.
You write uncommonly fast.
You are mistaken. I write rather slow.
How many letters you must have occasion to write in the course of the year. Letters of business, too. How odious I should think them.
It is fortunate, then, that they fall to my lot instead of to yours.
Pray, tell your sister that I long to see her.
I have already told her so once, by your desire.
Oh, I'm afraid you do not like your pen. Let me mend it for you. I mend pens remarkably well.
Thank you, but I always mend my own.
How can you contrive to write so even? Tell your sister I'm delighted to hear of her improvement on the harp. And pray, let her know that I am quite in raptures with her beautiful little design for a table, and I think it is infinitely superior to Miss Grantley's.
Will you give me leave to defer your raptures till I write again? At present I have not room to do them justice.
Oh, it is of no consequence. I shall see her in January. But do you always write such charming long letters to her, Mr. Darcy?
They are generally long, but whether always charming it is not for me to determine.
It is a rule with me that a person who can write a long letter with ease cannot write ill.
That will not do for a compliment to Darcy, Caroline, because he does not write with ease. He studies too much for words of 4 syllables. Do you not, Darcy?
My style of writing is very different from yours.
Oh, Charles writes in the most careless way imaginable. He leaves out half his words and blots out the rest.
My ideas flow so rapidly that I have not time to express them, by which means my letters sometimes convey no ideas at all to my correspondents.
Your humility, Mr. Bingley, must disarm reproof.
Nothing is more deceitful than the appearance of humility. It is often only carelessness of opinion, and sometimes an indirect boast.
And which of the two do you call my little recent piece of modesty?
The indirect boast. For you are really proud of your defects in writing, because you consider them as proceeding from a rapidity of thought and carelessness of execution which, if not estimable, you think at least highly interesting. When you told Mrs. Bennet this morning that if ever you resolved on quitting Netherfield you should be gone in 5 minutes, you meant it to be a sort of panegyric of compliment to yourself.
Upon my honour, I believed what I said of myself to be true, and I believe it at this moment. At least, therefore, I did not assume the character of needless precipitance merely to show off before the ladies.
I dare say you believed it, but I am by no means convinced that you would be gone with such celerity. Your conduct would be quite as dependent on chance as that of any man I know, and if, as you were mounting your horse, a friend were to say, "Bingley, you had better stay till next week," you would probably do it, and would probably not go, and at another word might stay a month.
You have only proved by this that Mr. Bingley did not do justice to his own disposition. You have shown him off now more than he did himself.
I am extremely gratified by your converting what my friend says into a compliment on the sweetness of my temper. But I am afraid you are giving it a turn which that gentleman did by no means intend. For he would certainly think the better of me if, under such a circumstance, I were to give a flat denial and ride off as fast as I could.
Would Mr. Darcy then consider the rashness of your original intention as atoned for by your obstinacy in adhering to it?
Upon my word, I cannot exactly explain the matter. Darcy must speak for himself.
You expect me to account for opinions which you choose to call mine, but which I have never acknowledged. Allowing the case, however, to stand according to your representation, you must remember, Miss Bennet, that the friend who is supposed to desire his return to the house, and the delay of his plan, has merely desired it, asked it, without offering one argument in favour of its propriety.
To yield readily, easily to the persuasion of a friend is no merit with you.
To yield without conviction is no compliment to the understanding of either.
You appear to me, Mr. Darcy, to allow nothing for the influence of friendship and affection. But in general and ordinary cases between friend and friend, where one of them is desired by the other to change a resolution of no very great moment, should you think ill of that person for complying with a desire without waiting to be argued into it?
Will it not be advisable, before we proceed on this subject, to arrange with rather more precision the degree of importance which is to appertain to request, as well as the degree of intimacy between the parties?
By all means, let us hear all the particulars, not forgetting their comparative height and size, for that will have more weight in the argument, Miss Bennet, than you may be aware of. I assure you that if Darcy were not such a great tall fellow in comparison with myself, I should not pay him half so much deference. I declare, I do not know a more awful object than Darcy on particular occasions and in particular places, at his own house especially, and of a Sunday evening when he has nothing to do.
I see your design, Bingley. You dislike an argument and want to silence this.
Perhaps I do. Arguments are too much like disputes. If you and Miss Bennet will defer yours until I'm out of the room, I shall be very thankful. and then you may say what you like of me.
What you ask is no sacrifice on my side, and Mr. Darcy had much better finish his letter.
Very well. And then I think we should have some music. On such occasions, do you not feel a great inclination, Miss Bennet, to seize the opportunity of dancing a reel? Miss Bennet?
Oh, I heard you before, but I could not immediately determine what to say in reply. You wanted me, I know, to say yes, that you might have the pleasure of despising my taste, but I always delight in overthrowing such kind of schemes, and cheating a person of their premeditated contempt. I therefore made up my mind to tell you that I would not want to dance a reel at all, and now despise me, if you dare.
Indeed, I do not dare.
Elizabeth, having rather expected to affront him, was amazed at his gallantry. But there was a mixture of sweetness and archness in her manner which made it difficult for her to affront anybody. And Darcy had never been bewitched by any woman as he was by her. Miss Bingley saw, or suspected, enough to be jealous. She often tried to provoke Darcy into disliking her guest by talking of their supposed marriage and planning his happiness in such an alliance.
I hope you will give your mother-in-law a few hints when this desirable event takes place as to the advantage of holding her tongue. And if you can compass it, do cure the younger girls of running after officers. And if I may mention so delicate a subject, endeavour to check that little something bordering on deceit and impertinence which your lady possesses.
Have you anything else to propose for my domestic felicity?
Oh, yes. Do let the portraits of your uncle and Aunt Phillips be placed in the gallery at Pemberley. Put them next to your great-uncle the judge. They are in the same profession, you know, only in different lines. As for your Elizabeth's picture, you must not attempt to have it taken, for what painter could paint those beautiful eyes?
When the ladies removed after dinner, Elizabeth attended her sister into the drawing room, where she was welcomed by her two friends with many protestations of pleasure. When tea was over, Mr. Hurst stretched himself on one of the sofas and fell asleep. Darcy took up a book, Miss Bingley did the same, and Mrs. Hurst, principally occupied in playing with her bracelets and rings, joined now and then in her brother's conversation with Miss Bennet. At length, quite exhausted by the attempt to be amused with her book, Miss Bingley gave a great yawn and said,
Oh, how pleasant it is to spend an evening in this way. I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading. How much sooner one tires of anything than of a book. When I have a house of my own, I shall be miserable if I have not an excellent library. By the by, Charles, are you really serious in meditating a dance at Netherfield? I would advise you, before you determine on it, to consult the wishes of the present party. I am much mistaken if there are not some among us to whom a ball would be rather a punishment than a pleasure.
If you mean Darcy, he may go to bed if he chooses before it begins. But as for the ball, it is quite a settled thing. And as soon as Nichols has made white soup enough, I shall send round my cards.
I should like balls infinitely better if they were carried on in a different manner. But there is something insufferably tedious in the usual process of such a meeting. It would surely be much more rational if conversation instead of dancing made the order of the day.
Much more rational, my dear Caroline, I dare say. But it would not be near so much like a ball.
There is altogether too much sitting still. Miss Eliza Bennet, let me persuade you to follow my example and take a turn about the room. I assure you it is very refreshing after sitting so long in one attitude. Ah, Mr. Darcy looks as though he might join us.
I think not. After all, it would surely interfere with either one of the two motives you have for walking up and down the room.
What can he mean? Miss Eliza, can you at all understand him?
Not at all. But depend upon it, he means to be severe on us, and our surest way of disappointing him will be to ask nothing about it.
I have not the smallest objection to explaining the two motives. You either choose this method of passing the evening because you are in each other's confidence and have secret affairs to discuss, or because you are conscious that your figures appear to the greatest advantage in walking. If the first, I should be completely in your way, and if the second, I can admire you much better as I sit by the fire.
Shocking! I never heard anything so abominable. How shall we punish him for such a speech?
Nothing so easy. If you have but the inclination, we can all plague and punish one another. Tease him, laugh at him. Intimate as you are, you must know how it is to be done.
But upon my honour, I do not. I do assure you that my intimacy has not yet taught me that. Tease calmness of temper and presence of mind. No, I feel he may defy us there. And as to laughter, we will not expose ourselves, if you please, by attempting to laugh without a subject. Mr. Darcy may hug himself.
Mr. Darcy is not to be laughed at. That is an uncommon advantage, and uncommon I hope it will continue, for it would be a great loss to me to have many such acquaintances. I dearly love a laugh.
Miss Bingley has given me credit for more than can be. The wisest and the best of men, nay, the wisest and best of their actions, may be rendered ridiculous by a person whose first object in life is a joke.
Certainly there are such people, but I hope I am not one of them. I hope I never ridicule what is wise or good. Follies and nonsense, whims and inconsistencies do divert me, I own, and I laugh at them whenever I can. But these, I suppose, are precisely what you are without.
Perhaps that is not possible for anyone, but it has been the study of my life to avoid those weaknesses which often expose a strong understanding to ridicule.
Such as vanity and pride.
Vanity is a weakness indeed, but pride. Where there is a real superiority of mind, pride will be always under good regulation.
Your examination of Mr. Darcy is over, I presume? And pray, what is the result?
I am perfectly convinced by it that Mr. Darcy has no defect. He owns it himself without disguise.
No, I have made no such pretension. I have faults enough, but they are not, I hope, of understanding. My temper I dare not vouch for. It is, I believe, too little yielding, certainly too little for the convenience of the world. I cannot forget the follies and vices of others so soon as I ought, nor their offences against myself. My good opinion, once lost, is lost forever.
Oh, that is a failing indeed. Implacable resentment is a shade in a character. But you have chosen your fault well. I really cannot laugh at it. You are safe from me.
There is, I believe, in every disposition a tendency to some particular evil, a natural defect, which not even the best education can overcome.
And your defect is a propensity to hate everybody.
And yours is wilfully to misunderstand them.
Do let us have a little music.
2 days later, having sent to Longbourn for the carriage, the sisters returned home after taking leave of their hosts at Netherfield. Mr. Bingley repeatedly tried to persuade Jane that it would not be safe for her to travel. Elizabeth was relieved to get away from Miss Bingley's uncivil ways. They were not welcomed home very cordially by their mother. Mrs. Bennet wondered at their coming, and was sure Jane would have caught cold again. At breakfast the following morning, Mr. Bennet addressed Mrs. Bennet.
I hope, my dear, that you've ordered a good dinner today, because I have reason to expect an addition to our family party.
Who do you mean, my dear? I know of nobody that is coming, I am sure. unless Charlotte Lucas should happen to call, and I hope my dinners are good enough for her. I do not believe she often sees such at home.
The person of whom I speak is a gentleman and a stranger.
A gentleman and a stranger? It is Mr. Bingley, I am sure. Why, Jane, you never dropped a word of this, you sly thing. Well, I am sure I shall be extremely glad to see Mr. Bingley. But, good Lord, oh, how unlucky. There is not a bit of fish to be got today. I must speak to Hill this moment.
It's not Mr. Bingley. It is a person whom I never saw in the whole course of my life. About a month ago I received this letter, and about a fortnight ago I answered it, for I thought it a case of some delicacy requiring early attention. It's from my cousin, Mr. Collins, who, when I am dead, may turn you all out of this house as soon as he pleases.
Oh, my dear, I cannot bear to hear that mentioned. Pray do not talk of that odious man. I do think it is the hardest thing in the world that your estate should be entailed away from your own children. And I am sure, if I had been you, I should have tried long ago to do something or other about it.
Jane and Elizabeth attempted to explain to Mrs. Bennet the nature of an entail. They had often attempted it before, but it was a subject on which Mrs. Bennet was beyond the reach of reason, and she continued to rail bitterly against the cruelty of settling an estate away from a family of 5 daughters.
It certainly is a most iniquitous affair, and nothing can clear Mr. Collins from the guilt of inheriting Longbourn. But if you will listen to his letter, you may perhaps be a little softened by his manner of expressing himself.
No, that I am sure I shall not. And I think it was very impertinent of him to write to you at all, and very hypocritical. I hate such false friends. Why could he not keep on quarrelling with you as his father did before him?
Why, indeed. He does seem to have had some filial scruples on that head, as you will hear. Dear Sir, the disagreement subsisting between yourself and my late honoured father always gave me much uneasiness, and since I have had the misfortune to lose him, I have frequently wished to heal the breach. But for some time I was kept back by my own doubts, fearing lest it might seem disrespectful to his memory for me to be on good terms with anyone with whom it had always pleased him to be at variance. There, Mrs. Bennet. My mind, however, is now made up on the subject, for having received ordination at Easter, I have been so fortunate as to be distinguished by the patronage of the Right Honourable Lady Catherine de Bourgh, widow of Sir Louis de Bourgh, whose bounty and beneficences preferred me to the valuable rectory of this parish, where it shall be my earnest endeavour to demean myself with grateful respect towards her ladyship, and be ever ready to perform those rites and ceremonies which are instituted by the Church of England. As a clergyman, however, I feel it my duty to promote and establish the blessing of peace in all families within the reach of my influence. And on these grounds I flatter myself that my present overtures of goodwill are highly commendable, and that the circumstance of my being next in the entail of Longbourn estate will be kindly overlooked on your side, and not lead to you to reject the offered olive branch. He goes on to assure us of his readiness to make amends, and says, I propose myself the satisfaction of waiting on you and your family Monday, November the 18th by 4 o'clock. Well, at 4 o'clock, therefore, we may expect this peacemaking gentleman. He seems to be a most conscientious and polite young man, upon my word, and I doubt not will prove a valuable acquaintance, especially if Lady Catherine should be so indulgent as to let him come and to see us again.
There is some sense in what he says about the girls, however, and if he is disposed to make them any amends, I shall not be the person to discourage him.
Though it is difficult to guess in what way he can mean to make us atonement he thinks our due, the wish is certainly to his credit.
He must be an oddity, I think. I cannot make him out. There's something very pompous in his style. And what can he mean by apologising for being next in the entail? cannot suppose he would help it if he could. Can he be a sensible man, sir?
No, my dear, I think not. I have great hopes of finding him quite the reverse. There is a mixture of servility and self-importance in his letter which promises well. I am impatient to see him.
Mr. Collins was punctual to his time and was received with great politeness by the whole family. Mr. Bennet indeed said little, but the ladies were ready enough to talk, and Mr. Collins seemed neither in need of encouragement nor inclined to be silent himself. He was a tall, heavy-looking young man of 25. His air was grave and stately, and his manners were very formal. He had not been long seated before he complimented Mrs. Bennet on having so fine a family of daughters.
You are very kind, Mr. Collins, I am sure, and I wish with all my heart it may prove so, for else they will be destitute enough. Things are settled so oddly.
You allude, perhaps, to the entail of this estate.
Ah, sir, I do indeed. It is a grievous affair to my poor girls, you must confess. Not that I mean to find fault with you, for such things I know are all of chance in this world. There is no knowing how estates will go when once they come to be entailed.
I am very sensible, madam, of the hardship to my fair cousins, and could say much on the subject, but I am cautious of appearing forward and precipitate. But I can assure the young ladies that I come prepared to admire them. At present I will say no more, but perhaps when we are better acquainted...
He was interrupted by a summons to dinner, during which Mr. Bennet spoke hardly at all. Mr. Collins, on the other hand, was eloquent on the subject of Lady Catherine de Bourgh, a lady through and through.
I dare say she is a very agreeable woman. It is a pity that great ladies in general are not more like her. Does she live near you, sir?
The garden in which stands my humble abode is separated only by a lane from Rosings Park, her ladyship's residence.
I think you said she was a widow, sir. Has she any family?
She has one only daughter, the heiress of Rosings, and of very extensive property.
Ah, then she is better off than many girls. And what sort of young lady is she? Is she handsome?
She is a most charming young lady indeed. Lady Catherine herself says that in point of true beauty, Miss de Bourgh is far superior to the handsomest of her sex, because there is that in her features which marks the young woman of distinguished birth. She is, unfortunately, of a sickly constitution, which has prevented her making that progress in many accomplishments which she could not otherwise have failed of. But she is perfectly amiable, and often condescends to drive by my humble abode in her little phaeton and ponies.
Has she been presented? I do not remember her among the ladies at court.
Her indifferent state of health unhappily prevents her being in town, and by that means, as I told Lady Catherine myself one day, has deprived the British court of its brightest ornament. Her ladyship seemed much pleased with the idea, and you may imagine that I am happy on every occasion to offer those little delicate compliments which are always acceptable to ladies.
You judge very properly, and it is happy for you that you possess the talent for flattering with delicacy. May I ask whether these pleasing attentions proceed from the impulse of the moment, or are the result of previous study?
They arise chiefly from what is passing at the time. And though I sometimes amuse myself with suggesting and arranging such little elegant compliments as may be adapted to ordinary occasions, I always wish to give them as unstudied an air as possible.
Mr. Bennet's expectations were fully answered. His cousin was fully as absurd as he'd hoped, and he listened to him with the keenest enjoyment, maintaining at the same time the most resolute composure of countenance. By tea-time, however, the dose had been enough, and Mr. Bennet was glad to take his guest into the drawing-room and invite him to read aloud to the ladies. A book was produced, but Mr. Collins protested that he never read novels. Other books were produced, from which he chose Fordyce's Sermons. Collins was not a sensible man, and the deficiency of nature had been but little assisted by education or society. A fortunate chance had recommended him to Lady Catherine de Bourgh when the living of Hunsford was vacant. The respect he felt for her high rank mingled with a very good opinion of himself. Having now a good house and very sufficient income, he intended to marry. And in seeking reconciliation with the Longbourn family, he had a wife in view, as he meant to choose one of the daughters, if he found them as handsome and amiable as they were represented by common report. His plan did not vary on seeing them. Miss Jane Bennet's lovely face confirmed his views. Mrs. Bennet, however, cautioned against the very Jane he had fixed on. She was likely to be very soon engaged. Mr. Collins had only to change from Jane to Elizabeth. Mr. Denny and Mr. Wickham walked with the young ladies to the door of Mr. Phillips' house. Some of them were to dine with the Phillips, and their aunt promised to make her husband call on Mr. Wickham and give him an invitation also. To Elizabeth's delight, a further opportunity for conversation with him occurred. She casually introduced the subject of Mr. Darcy. Without much prompting from her, he told how his father had managed the Pemberley estate, and had been the intimate friend of the late Mr. Darcy, who was in fact his own godfather. The two boys had grown up together and been treated as equals, a situation which the younger Darcy seemed to resent, and carried this resentment through to adulthood. It was intended, apparently, that Wickham should enter the church, and his godfather had bequeathed to him the best living he had in his gift, when it should become vacant. But his son had given it elsewhere. He asserted that Wickham had forfeited all claim to it by extravagance and imprudence. The terms of the will were too informal to contest, so he was obliged to make a career in the army instead. He added that even Darcy's sister, a girl of 15 or so, who had been immensely fond of him, had been turned against him. So he welcomed the employment of the army and the pleasant social life that Meryton afforded him. On hearing the name of Lady Catherine de Bourgh uttered by Mr. Collins, he inquired if Elizabeth knew that the former was the aunt of Mr. Darcy. Her sister, Lady Anne Darcy, had a daughter who would one day inherit a great fortune, and it was the intention of both ladies that she and Mr. Darcy should marry. Elizabeth related to Jane the next day what had passed between Mr. Wickham and herself. Jane listened with astonishment and concern. She knew not how to believe that Mr. Darcy could be so unworthy of Mr. Bingley's regard, and yet it was not in her nature to question the veracity of a young man of such amiable appearance as Wickham.
They have both been deceived, I dare say, in some way or other, of which we can form no idea. Interested people have perhaps misrepresented each to the other. It is, in short, impossible for us to conjecture the causes or circumstances which may have alienated them without actual blame on either side.
Very true indeed. And now, my dear Jane, what have you got to say on behalf of the interested people who have probably been concerned in the business? Do clear them too, or we shall be obliged to think ill of somebody.
Laugh as much as you choose, but you will not laugh me out of my opinion. My dearest Lizzie, do but consider in what a disgraceful light it places Mr. Darcy to be treating his father's favourite in such a manner, one whom his father had promised to provide for. It is impossible. No man of common humanity, no man who had any value for his character, could be capable of it. Can his most intimate friends be so excessively deceived in him? Oh, no.
I can much more easily believe Mr. Bingley's being imposed on than Mr. Wickham would invent such a history of himself as he gave me last night. Names, facts, everything mentioned without ceremony. If it had been not so, let Mr. Darcy contradict it. Besides, there was truth in his looks.
It is difficult indeed. It is distressing. One does not know what to think.
I beg your pardon. One knows exactly what to think.
So, Miss Eliza, I hear you are quite delighted with George Wickham. Your sister has been talking to me about him and asking me 1,000 questions. And I find that the young man forgot to tell you, among his other communications, that he was the son of old Wickham, the late Mr. Darcy's steward. Let me recommend you, however, as a friend, not to give implicit confidence to all his assertions. For as to Mr. Darcy's using him ill, it is perfectly false. For on the contrary, he has always been remarkably kind to him, though George Wickham has treated Mr. Darcy in a most infamous manner. I do not know the particulars, but I know very well that Mr. Darcy is not in the least to blame, that he cannot bear to hear George Wickham mentioned, and that, though my brother thought he could not well avoid including him in his invitation to the officers, he was excessively glad to find that he'd taken himself out of the way. His coming into the county at all is a most insolent thing indeed, and I wonder how he could presume to do it. I pity you, Miss Eliza, for this discovery of your favourite's guilt, but really, considering his descent, one could not expect much better.
His guilt and his descent appear by your account to be the same, for I have heard you accuse him of nothing worse than of being the son of Mr. Darcy's steward, and of that I can assure you he informed me himself.
I beg your pardon. Excuse my interference. It was kindly meant.
Ah, Jane, I want to know what you have learnt about Mr. Wickham. But perhaps you have been too pleasantly engaged to think of any third person, in which case you may be sure of my pardon.
No, I have not forgotten him, but I have nothing satisfactory to tell you. Mr. Bingley does not know the whole of his history, and is quite ignorant of the circumstances which have principally offended Mr. Darcy, but he will vouch for the good conduct, the probity, and honour of his friend, and is perfectly convinced that Mr. Wickham has deserved much less attention from Mr. Darcy than he has received. And I am sorry to say that by his account, as well as his sister's, Mr. Wickham is by no means a respectable young man. I am afraid he has been very imprudent, and has deserved to lose Mr. Darcy's regards.
Mr. Bingley does not know Mr. Wickham himself?
No, he never saw him till the other morning at Meryton.
This account, then, is what he has received from Mr. Darcy. I am perfectly satisfied. But what does he say of the living?
He does not exactly recollect the circumstances, though he has heard them from Mr. Darcy more than once. But he believes it was left to him conditionally only.
I have not a doubt of Mr. Bingley's sincerity, but you must excuse my not being convinced by assurances only. Mr. Bingley's defence of his friend was a very able one, I dare say, but since he is unacquainted with several parts of the story, and has learnt the rest from that friend himself, I shall venture to think of both gentlemen as I did before.
The next day opened a new scene at Longbourn. Mr. Collins made his declaration in form. On finding Mrs. Bennet, Elizabeth, and one of the younger girls together soon after breakfast, he addressed the mother in these words.
May I hope, madam, for your interest with your fair daughter Elizabeth, when I solicit for the honour of a private audience with her in the course of this morning?
Oh, dear. Yes, certainly. I am sure Lizzie will be very happy. I am sure she can have no objection. Come, Kitty. I want you upstairs.
Oh, dear ma'am, do not go. I beg you will not go. Mr. Collins must excuse me. He can have nothing to say to me that anybody need not hear. I am going away myself.
I desire you will stay where you are. Lizzie, I insist upon your staying and hearing Mr. Collins.
Believe me, my dear Miss Elizabeth, that your modesty, so far from doing you any disservice, rather adds to your other perfections. You would have been less amiable in my eyes had there not been this little unwillingness. But allow me to assure you that I have your respected mother's permission for this address. You can hardly doubt the purport of my discourse. However, your natural delicacy may lead you to dissemble. My attentions have been too marked to be mistaken. Almost as soon as I entered the house, I singled you out as the companion of my future life. But before I am run away with by my feelings on this subject, perhaps it will be advisable for me to state my reasons for marrying. First, that I think it a right thing for every clergyman in easy circumstances, like myself, to set the example of matrimony in his parish. Secondly, that I am convinced it will add very greatly to my happiness. And thirdly, which perhaps I ought to have mentioned earlier, that it is the particular advice and recommendation of the very noble lady whom I have the honour of calling patroness, that I should get married. Thus much for my general intention in favour of matrimony. It remains to be told why my views were directed towards you.
You are too hasty, sir. You forget that I have made no answer. Let me do it without farther loss of time. Accept my thanks for the compliment you are paying me. I am very sensible of the honour of your proposals, but it is impossible for me to do otherwise than decline them.
I am not now to learn that it is unusual with young ladies to reject the addresses of the man whom they secretly mean to accept when he first applies for their favour. I am, therefore, by no means discouraged by what you have just said, and shall hope to lead you to the altar ere long.
Oh, upon my word, sir, your hope is rather an extraordinary one after my declaration. I do assure you that I am not one of those young ladies, if such young ladies there are, who are so daring as to risk their happiness on the chance of being asked a second time. I am perfectly serious in my refusal. Please let me finish. You could not make me happy, and I am convinced that I am the last person in the world who would make you so. Nay, were your friend Lady Catherine to know me, I am perfectly certain she would find me in every respect ill qualified for the situation.
You may be certain that when I have the honour of seeing her again, I shall speak in the highest terms of your modesty, economy, and other amiable qualifications.
Indeed, Mr. Collins, all praise of me will be unnecessary. You must give me leave to judge for myself and pay me the compliment of believing what I say.
But I still think...
I'm making the offer. You must have satisfied the delicacy of your feelings with regard to my family and may take possession of Longbourn Estate whenever it falls without any self-reproach. This matter may be considered, therefore, as finally settled.
When I do myself the honour of speaking to you next on this subject, I shall hope to receive a more favourable answer than you have now given me.
Please, Mr. Collins.
I am far from accusing you of cruelty at present, because I know it to be the established custom of your sex to reject a man on the first application.
Really, Mr. Collins, you puzzle me exceedingly. If what I have hitherto said can appear to you in the form of encouragement, I know not how to express my refusal in such a way as may convince you of its being one.
You must give me leave to flatter myself, my dear cousin, that your refusal of my addresses are merely words of course. My reasons for believing it are...
I do assure you, sir, that I have no pretension whatever to that kind of elegance which consists in tormenting a respectable man. I would rather be paid the compliment of being believed to be sincere. I thank you again and again for the honour you have done me in your proposals, but to accept them is absolutely impossible. Can I speak plainer?
You are uniformly charming, and I am persuaded that when sanctioned by both your excellent parents, my proposals will not fail of being acceptable.
Engaged to Mr. Collins? My dear Charlotte, impossible.
Why should you be surprised, my dear Eliza? Do you think it incredible that Mr. Collins should be able to procure any woman's good opinion because he was not so happy as to succeed with you?
Of course not. Charlotte, nothing of the kind. It's just that...
I see what you are feeling. You must be surprised, very much surprised, so lately as Mr. Collins was wishing to marry you. But when you have had time to think it all over, I hope you will be satisfied with what I have done. I am not romantic. You know, I never was. I ask only a comfortable home, and considering Mr. Collins' character, connections, and situation in life, I am convinced that my chance of happiness with him is as fair as most people can boast on entering the marriage state.
Undoubtedly.
Indeed, Mr. Bennet, it is very hard to think that Charlotte Lucas should ever be mistress of this house, that I should be forced to make way for her, and live to see her take my place in it.
My dear, do not give way to such gloomy thoughts. Let us hope for better things. Let us flatter ourselves that I may be the survivor.
I cannot bear to think that they should have all this estate. If it was not for the entail, I should not mind it.
What should you not mind?
I should not mind anything at all.
Let us be thankful that you are preserved from such a state of insensibility.
I never can be thankful, Mr. Bennet, for anything about the entail. How anyone could have the conscience to entail away an estate from one's own daughters, I cannot understand. And all for the sake of Mr. Collins, too. Why should he have it more than anybody else?
I leave it to yourself to determine.
It seemed to the Miss Bennets that the Bingleys' absence from Netherfield was becoming an established fact of uncertain duration, but a letter arrived from Miss Bingley, putting an end to any doubts they might have had on the score. The very first sentence conveyed the assurance of their being all settled in London for the winter, and concluded with Mr. Bingley's regret at not having had time to pay his respects to his friend in Hertfordshire before he left the country. A day or two passed before Jane had courage to speak of her feelings to Elizabeth.
I will not repine. This wretchedness cannot last long. He will be forgotten. We shall all be as we were before.
Oh, my dear Jane.
You doubt me. Indeed, you have no reason. He may live in my memory as the most amiable man of my acquaintance, but that is all. I have nothing either to hope for or fear, and nothing to reproach him for, thank God. I have not that pain. A little time, therefore.
Jane, please, I wish it were all not so...
I have this comfort immediately, that it has not been more than an error of fancy on my side, and that it has done no harm to anyone but myself.
My dear Jane, you are too good. Your sweetness is really angelic. I do not know what to say to you. I feel as if I had never done you justice or loved you as you deserve.
Oh, dear Elizabeth, you judge me too kindly.
Nay, this is not fair. You wish to think all the world respectable, and are hurt if I speak ill of anybody. I only want to think you perfect, and you set yourself against it. There are few people whom I really love, and still fewer of whom I think well. The more I see of the world, the more I am dissatisfied with it. I have met with 2 instances lately. One I will not mention. The other is Charlotte and her marriage. It is unaccountable. In every view it is unaccountable.
Oh, my dear Lizzie, do not give way to such feelings as these. They will ruin your happiness. You do not make allowance enough for difference of situation and temper. Consider Mr. Collins's respectability and Charlotte's prudent, steady character. Remember that she is one of a large family, that as to fortune it is a most eligible match, and be ready to believe for everybody's sake that she may feel something like regard and esteem for our cousin.
Oh, to oblige you, I would try to believe almost anything, but no one else could be benefited by such a belief as this. For were I persuaded that Charlotte had any regard for him, I should only think worse of her, understanding that I now do of her heart. My dear Jane, Mr. Collins is a conceited, pompous, narrow-minded, silly man. You know he is, as well as I do. And you must feel as well as I do that the woman who marries him cannot have a proper way of thinking. You shall not defend her, though it is Charlotte Lucas.
I must think your language too strong in speaking of both, and I hope you will be convinced of it by seeing them happy together. But enough of this. You alluded to something else. You mentioned 2 instances. I cannot understand you, But I entreat you, dear Lizzie, not to pain me by thinking that person to blame and saying your opinion of him has sunk. We must not be so ready to fancy ourselves intentionally injured. We must not expect a lively young man to always be so guarded and circumspect. It is very often nothing but our own vanity that deceives us. Women fancy admiration means more than it does.
And men take care that they should.
It is designedly done.
I am far from attributing any part of Mr. Bingley's conduct to design, but without scheming to do wrong or to make others unhappy, there may be error, there may be misery, thoughtlessness, want of attention to other people's feelings, and want of resolution will do the business.
And do you impute it to either of those?
Yes, to the last. But if I go on, I shall displease you by saying what I think of persons you esteem. Stop me whilst you can.
You persist, then, in supposing his sisters influence him?
Yes, in conjunction with his friend.
I cannot believe it. Why should they try to influence him? They can only wish his happiness, and if he is attached to me, no other woman can secure it.
Your first position is false. They may wish many things besides his happiness. They may wish his increase of wealth and consequence. They may wish him to marry a girl who has all the importance of money, great connections, and pride.
Beyond a doubt, they do wish him to choose Miss Darcy, but this may be from better feelings than you are supposing. They have known her much longer than they have known me. No wonder if they love her better. But whatever may be their own wishes, it is very unlikely they should have opposed their brothers. What sister would think herself at liberty to do it, unless there was something very objectionable? If they believed him attached to me, they would not try to part us. If he were so, they would not succeed. I am not ashamed of having been mistaken, or at least it is slight. It is nothing in comparison with what I should feel in thinking ill of him or his sisters. Let me take it in the best light, in the light in which it may be understood.
Elizabeth could not oppose such a wish, and from this time Mr. Bingley's name was scarcely ever mentioned between them. On the following Monday, Mrs. Bennet had the pleasure of receiving her brother and his wife, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner, who came as usual to spend the Christmas at Longbourn. Mr. Gardiner was a sensible, gentlemanlike man, greatly superior to his sister, as well by nature as education. Mrs. Gardiner, who was several years younger than Mrs. Bennet and Mrs. Phillips, was an amiable, intelligent, elegant woman, and a great favourite with all her Longbourn nieces who'd frequently been staying with her in London. When alone with Elizabeth after dinner, Mrs. Gardiner expressed her sympathy with Jane over the loss of Mr. Bingley.
It seems likely to have been a desirable match for Jane. I am sorry it went off. But these things happen so often. A young man, such as you describe Mr. Bingley, so easily falls in love with a pretty girl for a few weeks, and when accident separates them, so easily forgets her, that these sort of inconsistencies are very frequent.
An excellent consolation in its way, but it will not do for us. We do not suffer by accident. It does not often happen that the interference of friends will persuade a young man of independent fortune to think no more of a girl whom he was violently in love with only a few days before.
But that expression of violently in love is so hackneyed, so doubtful, so indefinite, that it gives me very little idea. It is as often applied to feelings which arise only from half an hour's acquaintance as to a real, strong attachment. Pray, how violent was Mr. Bingley's love?
I never saw a more promising inclination. He was growing quite inattentive to other people and wholly engrossed by her. Every time they met it was more decided and remarkable. At his own ball, he offended 2 or 3 young ladies by not asking them to dance, and I spoke to him twice myself without receiving an answer. Could there be finer symptoms? Is not general incivility the very essence of love?
Oh, yes, of that kind of love which I suppose him to have felt. Poor Jane. I am sorry for her, because with such a disposition she may not get over it immediately. It had better have happened to you, Lizzie. You would have laughed yourself out of it sooner. But do you think she could be prevailed on to go back with us? Change of scene might be of service, and perhaps a little relief from home may be as useful as anything.
I think you have found the answer, and relief is needed, I agree.
I hope that no consideration with regard to this young man will influence her. We live in so different a part of town. All our connections are so different, and as you well know, we go out so little, that it is very improbable that they should meet at all, unless he really comes to see her.
And that is quite impossible, for he is now in the custody of his friend, and Mr. Darcy would no more suffer him to call on Jane in such a part of town. My dear aunt, how could you think of it? Mr. Darcy may perhaps have heard of such a place as Gracechurch Street, but he would hardly think a month's ablution enough to cleanse him from its impurities were he once to enter it. And depend upon it, Mr. Bingley never stirs without him.
So much the better. I hope they will not meet at all. But does not Jane correspond with the sister? She will not be able to help calling.
She will drop the acquaintance entirely.
In spite of her certainty on this point, Elizabeth felt a solicitude on the subject which convinced her, on examination, that she did not consider it entirely hopeless, that Mr. Bingley's affection might be reanimated, and the influence of his friend successfully combated by the more natural influence of Jane's attractions. Miss Bennet accepted her aunt's invitation with pleasure. During their stay at Longbourn, Mrs. Gardiner had occasion to observe Elizabeth and Mr. Wickham together, and their preference of each other was plain enough to make her a little uneasy. Mrs. Gardiner's caution to Elizabeth was punctually and kindly given on the first favourable opportunity. Jane Bennet went to London with the Gardiners, but after 4 weeks had heard nothing from the Bingleys, much to her disappointment. March was to take Elizabeth to Hunsford to visit Charlotte, now Collins, and her husband. Mr. Collins was very proud indeed.
Ah, my dear Charlotte, come and tell us what they said. Is Mr. Berg well?
Yes, quite well. She came to ask us to dine at Rosings tomorrow. All of us. Is that not kind?
I confess that I should not have been at all surprised by her ladyship's asking us on Sunday to drink tea and spend the evening at Rosings. I rather expected from my knowledge of her affability that it would happen. But who could have foreseen such an attention as this? Who could have imagined that we should receive an invitation to dine there, the whole party, so immediately after your arrival? But do not make yourself uneasy, my dear cousin, about your apparel. Lady Catherine is far from requiring that elegance of dress in us which becomes herself and daughter. I would advise you merely to put on whatever of your clothes is superior to the rest. There is no occasion for anything more.
On the morrow, as the weather was fine, they had a pleasant walk of about half a mile across the park. Elizabeth found that nothing was beneath Lady Catherine's attention which could furnish her with an occasion to dictate to others. In the intervals of her discourse with Charlotte Collins, she addressed a variety of questions to Elizabeth.
Your father's estate is entailed on Mr. Collins, I think. For your sake I am glad of it, but otherwise I see no occasion for entailing estates from the female line. It is not thought necessary in Sir Louis de Bourgh's family. Do you play and sing, Miss Bennet?
A little.
Oh, then sometime or other we shall be happy to hear you. Our instrument is a capital one, probably superior to... You shall try it some day. Do your sisters play and sing?
One of them does.
Why did you not all learn? You ought all to have learned. The Miss Maples play, and their father has not so good an income as yours. Do you draw?
No, not at all.
What? None of you?
Not one.
That is very strange. But I suppose you had no opportunity. Your mother should have taken you to town every spring for the benefit of masters.
My mother would have had no objection, but my father hates London.
Has your governess left you?
We never had any governess.
No governess? How was that possible? 5 daughters brought up at home without a governess? I never heard of such a thing. Your mother must have been quite a slave to your education.
Hardly.
Then who taught you? Who attended to you? Without a governess, you must have been neglected.
Compared with some families, I believe we were. But such of us as wished to learn never wanted the means. We were always encouraged to read and had all the masters that were necessary. Those who chose to be idle certainly might.
Aye, no doubt. But that is what a governess will prevent. And if I had known your mother, I should have advised her most strenuously to engage one. I always say that nothing is to be done in education without steady and regular instruction, and nobody but a governess can give it. Are any of your younger sisters out, Miss Bennet?
Yes, ma'am, all.
All? What? All 5 out at once? Very odd. And you only the second. The younger ones, out before the elder, are married. Your younger sisters must be very young.
Yes, my youngest is not 16. Perhaps she is full young to be much in company. But really, ma'am, I think it would be very hard upon younger sisters that they should not have their share of society and amusement, because the elder may not have the means or inclination to marry early. I think it would not be very likely to promote sisterly affection or delicacy of mind.
Upon my word, you give your opinion very decidedly for so young a person. Pray, what is your age?
With 3 younger sisters grown up, your ladyship can hardly expect me to own it.
Well, you cannot be more than 20, I'm sure. Therefore, you need not conceal your age.
When the gentlemen had joined them, the card tables were placed. When Lady Catherine and her daughter had played as long as they chose, the tables were broke up, the carriage was offered to Mrs. Collins, gratefully accepted, and immediately ordered. The entertainment of dining at Rosings was repeated about twice a week, and every such entertainment was the counterpart of the first. In this way, the first fortnight of Elizabeth's visit with the Collinses soon passed away. One day, Mr. Collins returned from his turn in the park to say that 2 nephews of Lady Catherine's were visiting Rosings, Mr. Darcy and a Colonel Fitzwilliam, the younger son of his uncle. And to the great surprise of all the party, the gentleman accompanied him. Colonel Fitzwilliam, after the necessary introductions, entered into conversation directly with the readiness and ease of a well-bred man. But his cousin, after having addressed a slight observation on the house and garden to Mrs. Collins, sat for some time without speaking to anybody. At length, however, his civility was so far awakened as to enquire of Elizabeth after the health of her family. She answered him in the usual way, and after a moment's pause added,
My elder sister has been in town these 3 months. Have you never happened to see her there?
No, I have not been so fortunate as to meet Miss Bennet.
Miss Bennet, I must tell you how delightful I have found Hertfordshire. You do live in very handsome country.
What is that you're saying, Fitzwilliam?
What do you think of Kent? I find that very agreeable too.
What is it you're talking of? What are you telling Miss Bennet? Let me hear what it is.
We are speaking of the country and music.
Oh, music. Then pray, speak aloud. It is of all subjects my delight. I must have my share in the conversation if you are speaking of music. There are few people in England, I suppose, who have more true enjoyment of music than myself, or a better natural taste. If I had ever learnt, I should have been greatly proficient. And so would Anne, if her health had allowed her to apply. I am confident that she would have performed delightfully. How does Georgiana get on, Darcy?
She does very well. She is, in fact, becoming quite proficient, thank you.
I'm very glad to hear such a good account of her, and pray tell her from me that she cannot expect to excel if she does not practice a great deal.
I assure you, madam, that she does not need much advice. She practices very constantly.
So much the better. It cannot be done too much, and when I'm right next to her, I shall charge her not to neglect it on any account. I often tell young ladies that no excellence in music is to be acquired without constant practice. I have told Miss Bennet several times that she will never play really well unless she practices more. And though Mrs. Collins has no instrument, she is very welcome, as I often told her to come to Rosings every day and play on the pianoforte in Mrs. Jenkins' room. She would be in nobody's way, you know, in that part of the house.
Now that coffee is over, we are all ready for some music. Miss Elizabeth, you promised.
I did, and so it shall be. You mean to frighten me, Mr. Darcy, by coming in all this state to hear me? But I will not be alarmed, though your sister does play so well. There is a stubbornness about me that never can bear to be frightened at the will of others. My courage always rises with every attempt to intimidate me.
I shall not say that you are mistaken, because you could not really believe me to entertain any design of alarming you. And I have had the pleasure of your acquaintance long enough to know that you find great enjoyment in occasionally professing opinions which in fact are not your own.
Colonel Fitzwilliam, your cousin will give you a very pretty notion of me and teach you not to believe a word I say. I am particularly unlucky in meeting with a person so well able to expose my real character, in a part of the world where I had hoped to pass myself off with some degree of credit. Indeed, Mr. Darcy, it is very ungenerous in you to mention all that you knew to my disadvantage in Hertfordshire.
Pray, let me hear what you have to accuse him of. I should like to know how he behaves amongst strangers.
You shall hear then, but prepare yourself for something very dreadful. The first time I ever seeing him in Hertfordshire, you must know, was at a ball. And at this ball, what do you think he did? He danced only 4 dances, though gentlemen were scarce, and to my certain knowledge, more than one young lady was sitting down in want of a partner. Mr. Darcy, you cannot deny the fact.
I had not at that time the honour of knowing any lady in the assembly beyond my own party.
True, and nobody can ever be introduced in a ballroom.
Perhaps I should have judged better had I sought an introduction, but I am ill qualified to recommend myself to strangers.
Shall we ask your cousin the reason for this? Shall we ask him why a man of sense and education and who has lived in the world is ill qualified to recommend himself to strangers?
I can answer your question without applying to him. It is because he will not give himself the trouble.
I certainly have not the talent which some people possess in conversing easily with those I have not seen before. I cannot catch their tones of conversation or appear interested in their concerns, as I often see done.
What is that you are saying, Darcy? What are you talking of?
When daisies pine and violets bloom, and lady smokes old silver white, and cocoa buds of yellow blue.
Lady Catherine continued her remarks on Elizabeth's playing, mixing with them many instructions on execution and taste. Elizabeth received them with all the forbearance of civility. Elizabeth was sitting by herself the next morning and writing to Jane when the door opened, and to her very great surprise, Mr. Darcy, and Mr. Darcy only, entered the room. He seemed astonished too on finding her alone, and apologized for his intrusion by letting her know that he had understood all the ladies to be within. They then sat down, and when her inquiries after Rosings were made, seemed in danger of sinking into total silence.
How very suddenly you all quitted Netherfield last November, Mr. Darcy. It must have been a most agreeable surprise to Mr. Bingley to see you all after him so soon, for if I recollect right, he went but the day before. He and his sisters were well, I hope, when you left London?
Perfectly so, I thank you.
I think I have understood that Mr. Bingley has not much idea of ever returning to Netherfield again.
I have never heard him say so, but it is probable that he may spend very little of his time there in future. He has many friends, and he is at a time in life when friends and engagements are continually increasing.
If he means to be but little at Netherfield, it would be better for the neighbourhood that he should give up the place entirely, for then we might possibly get a settled family there. But perhaps Mr. Bingley did not take the house so much for the convenience of the neighbourhood as for his own, and we must expect him to keep or quit it on the same principle.
I should not be surprised if he were to give it up as soon as any eligible purchase offers. This seems a very comfortable house. Lady Catherine, I believe, did a great deal to it when Mr. Collins first came to Hunsford.
I believe she did, and I am sure she could not have bestowed her kindness on a more grateful object.
Mr. Collins appears very fortunate in his choice of a wife.
Yes, indeed. His friends may well rejoice in his having met with one of the very few sensible women who would have accepted him, or have made him happy if they had. My friend has an excellent understanding, though I am not certain that I consider her marrying Mr. Collins as the wisest thing she ever did. She seems perfectly happy, however, and in a prudential light it is certainly a very good match for her.
It must be very agreeable for her to be settled within so easy a distance of her own family and friends.
An easy distance, do you call it?
And what is 50 miles of good road? Little more than half a day's journey. Yes, I call it a very easy distance.
I should never have considered the distance as one of the advantages of the match. I should never have said Mrs. Collins was settled near her family.
It is a proof of your own attachment to Hertfordshire. Anything beyond the very neighbourhood of Longbourn, I suppose, would appear far.
I do not mean to say that a woman may not be settled too near her family. The far and the near must be relative, and depend on many varying circumstances. And where there is a fortune to make the expense of travelling unimportant, distance becomes no evil. But that is not the case here. Mr. and Mrs. Collins have a comfortable income, but not such a one as will allow of frequent journeys, and I am persuaded my friend would not call herself near her family under less than half the present distance.
You cannot have a right to such very strong local attachment. You cannot have been always at Longbourn.
Mr. Darcy called quite often at the parsonage. Why? It was difficult to understand. It could not be for society, as he frequently sat there 10 minutes together without opening his lips. Mrs. Collins knew not what to make of him. More than once did Elizabeth in her ramble within the park unexpectedly meet Mr. Darcy. He never said a great deal, nor did she give herself the trouble of talking or of listening much. But it struck her in the course of their third rencontre that he was asking some odd, unconnected questions about her pleasure in being at Hunsford, her love of solitary walks, and her opinion of Mr. and Mrs. Collins' happiness. She was engaged one day as she walked in reperusing Jane's last letter when she saw, on looking up, that Colonel Fitzwilliam was meeting her. She put away her letter and said with a forced smile,
"Oh, I did not know before that you ever walked this way."
No, I've been making the tour of the park, as I generally do every year, and intend to close it with a call at the parsonage. Are you going much farther?
No, I should have turned in a moment.
Oh.
Do you certainly leave Kent on Saturday?
Yes, if Darcy does not put it off again, but I am at his disposal. He arranges the business just as he pleases.
And if not able to please himself in the arrangement, he has at least great pleasure in the power of choice. I do not know anybody who seems more to enjoy the power of doing what he likes than Mr. Darcy.
He likes to have his own way very well, but so we all do. It is only that he has better means of having it than many others, because he is rich and many others are poor. I speak feelingly. A younger son, you know, must be inured to self-denial and dependence.
In my opinion, the younger son of an earl can know very little or either. Seriously, what have you ever known of self-denial and dependence? When have you been prevented by want of money from going wherever you chose, or procuring anything you had a fancy for?
These are home questions, and perhaps I cannot say that I have experienced many hardships of that nature. But in matters of greater weight I may suffer from the want of money. Younger sons cannot marry whom they like.
Unless where they like women of fortune, which I think they very often do.
Our habits of expense make us too dependent, and there are not many in my rank of life who can afford to marry without some attention to money.
And pray, what is the usual price of an earl's younger son? Unless the elder brother is very sickly, I suppose you would not ask above £50,000.
Well,
I imagine your cousin brought you down with him chiefly for the sake of having somebody at his disposal. I wonder he does not marry to secure a lasting convenience of that kind. But perhaps his sister does as well for the present. And as she is under his sole care, he may do what he likes with her.
No, that is an advantage which he must divide with me. I am joined with him in the guardianship of Miss Darcy.
Are you indeed? And pray, what sort of guardian do you make? Does your charge give you much trouble? Young ladies of her age are sometimes a little difficult to manage. And if she has the true Darcy spirit, she may like to have her own way.
But what makes you think... Do you know of any reasons for uneasiness?
Oh, no need to be frightened. I never heard any harm of her. And I dare say she is one of the most tractable creatures in the world. She is a very great favourite with some ladies of my acquaintance, Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley. I think I have heard you say that you know them.
Oh, I know them a little. Their brother is a pleasant, gentleman-like man. He is a great friend of Darcy's.
Oh, yes. Mr. Darcy is uncommonly kind to Mr. Bingley and takes a prodigious deal of care of him.
Care of him? Oh, yes, I really believe Darcy does take care of him in those points where he most wants care. From something he told me in our journey hither, I have reason to think Bingley very much indebted to him. But I ought to beg his pardon, for I have no right to suppose that Bingley was the person meant. It was all conjecture.
What is it you mean?
It is a circumstance which Darcy, of course, would not wish to be generally known, because if it were to get round to the lady's family, it would be an unpleasant thing.
You may depend upon my not mentioning it.
And remember that I have not much reason for supposing it to be Bingley. What he told me was merely this, that he congratulated himself on having lately saved a friend from the inconvenience of a most imprudent marriage, but without mentioning names or any other particulars, and I only suspected it to be Bingley from believing him the kind of young man to get into a scrape of that sort, and from knowing them to have been together the whole of last summer.
Did Mr. Darcy give you his reasons for this interference?
I understood that there were some very strong objections against this lady.
And what arts did he use to separate them?
Well, he did not talk to me of his own arts. He only told me what I have now told you.
I am thinking of what you have been telling me. Your cousin's conduct does not suit my feelings. Why has he to be the judge?
You are rather disposed to call his interference officious?
I do not see what right Mr. Darcy has to decide on the propriety of his friend's inclination, or why, upon his own judgment alone, he was to determine and direct in what manner that friend was to be happy. But as we know none of the particulars, it is not fair to condemn him. It is not to be supposed that there was much affection in the case.
That is not an unnatural surmise, but it is lessening the honour of my cousin's triumph very sadly.
The agitation and tears which the subject occasioned brought on a headache, and it grew so much worse towards the evening that, added to her unwillingness to see Mr. Darcy, it determined Elizabeth not to attend her cousins to Rosings. When they were gone, Elizabeth, as if intending to exasperate herself as much as possible against Mr. Darcy, chose for her employment the examination of all the letters which Jane had written to her since her being in Kent. She was suddenly roused by the sound of the doorbell, and her spirits were a little fluttered by the idea of its being Colonel Fitzwilliam himself, who had once before called late in the evening. To her utter amazement, she saw Mr. Darcy walk into the room. He sat down for a few moments, then got up and walked about the room. After a silence of several minutes, he came towards her in an agitated manner, and told her how he had struggled and known that his feelings would not be repressed. She must allow him, he said, to tell her how ardently he admired and loved her. Elizabeth's astonishment was beyond expression. She stared, coloured, doubted, and was silent. This Darcy considered sufficient encouragement, and the avowal of all that he felt and had long felt for her immediately followed. He spoke well, but there were feelings besides those of the heart to be detailed. His sense of her inferiority, of its being a degradation of the family obstacles. Elizabeth tried to compose herself to answer him with patience, and when he ceased, the colour rose into her cheek, and she said,
"In such a case as this, it is, I believe, the established mode to express a sense of obligation for the sentiments avowed, however unequally they may be returned. It is natural that obligation should be felt, and if I could feel gratitude, I would now thank you. But I cannot. I have never desired your good opinion, and you have certainly bestowed it most unwillingly. I am sorry to have occasioned pain to anyone. It has been most unconsciously done, however, and I hope will be of short duration. The feelings which you tell me have long prevented the acknowledgement of your regard can have little difficulty in overcoming it after this explanation."
And this is all the reply which I am to have the honour of expecting? I might perhaps wish to be informed why, with so little endeavour at civility, I am thus rejected, but it is of small importance.
I might as well inquire why, with so evident a design of offending and insulting me, you chose to tell me that you liked me against your will, against your reason, and even against your character. Was not this some excuse for incivility, if I was uncivil? But I have other provocations, you know I have. Had not my own feelings decided against you, had they been indifferent, or had they even been favourable, do you think that any consideration would tempt me to accept the man who has been the means of ruining, perhaps forever, the happiness of a beloved sister?
Now, what is...
I have every reason in the world to think ill of you. No motive can excuse the unjust and ungenerous part you acted there. You dare not... You cannot deny that you have been the principal, if not the only means of dividing them from each other, of exposing one to the censure of the world for caprice and instability, the other to its derision for disappointed hopes, and involving them both in misery of the acutest kind. Well, can you deny that you have done it?
I have no wish of denying that I did everything in my power to separate my friend from your sister, or that I rejoice in my success. Towards him I have been kinder than towards myself.
But it is not merely this affair on which my dislike is founded. Long before it had taken place, my opinion of you was decided. Your character was unfolded in the recital which I received many months ago from Mr. Wickham. On this subject, what can you have to say? In what imaginary act of friendship can you here defend yourself? Or under what misrepresentations can you here impose upon others?
You take an eager interest in that gentleman's concerns.
Who that knows what misfortunes have been can help feeling an interest in him?
His misfortunes. Yea, his misfortunes have been great indeed.
And of your infliction. You have reduced him to his present state of poverty, comparative poverty. You have withheld the advantages which you must know to have been designed for him. You have deprived the best years of his life of that independence which was no less his due than his... You have done all this, and yet you can treat the mention of his misfortunes with contempt and ridicule.
And this is your opinion of me. This is the estimation in which you hold me. I thank you for explaining it so fully. My faults, according to this calculation, are heavy indeed. But perhaps these offences might have been overlooked, had not your pride been hurt by my honest confession of the scruples that had long prevented my forming any serious design. These bitter accusations might have been suppressed had I, with greater policy, concealed my struggles and flattered you into the belief of my being impelled by unqualified, unalloyed inclination, by reason, by reflection, by everything. But disguise of every sort is my abhorrence. Nor am I ashamed of the feelings I related. They were natural and just. Could you expect me to rejoice in the inferiority of your connections, to congratulate myself on the hope of relations whose condition in life is so decidedly beneath my own?
You are mistaken, Mr. Darcy, if you suppose that the mode of your declaration affected me in any way than as it spared me the concern which I might have felt in refusing you, had you behaved in a more gentlemanlike manner. You could not have made me the offer of your hand in any possible way that would have tempted me to accept it. Your arrogance, your conceit, and your selfish disdain of the feelings of others were such as to form that groundwork of disapprobation on which succeeding events have built so immovable dislike.
You have said quite enough, madam. I perfectly comprehend your feelings, and have now only to be ashamed of what my own have been. Forgive me for having taken up so much of your time, and accept my best wishes for your health and happiness.
Elizabeth awoke the next morning to the same thoughts and meditations which had at length closed her eyes. She resolved soon after breakfast to indulge herself in air and exercise. The park paling was the boundary on one side, and she soon passed one of the gates into the ground. She was on the point of continuing her walk when she caught a glimpse of a gentleman within the sort of grove which edged the park. He was moving that way, and, fearful of its being Mr. Darcy, she was directly retreating. She had turned away, but on hearing herself called, she turned back and saw that it was indeed Mr. Darcy, and that he was holding out a letter which she instinctively took. With a slight bow, he turned again into the plantation, and was soon out of sight. Elizabeth opened the letter and found 2 sheets of paper written quite through in a very close hand. In his letter, Mr. Darcy did not make any further claim for her hand. He wrote rather to exonerate himself of the offences he had been accused of by her. As far as Mr. Bingley was concerned, Mr. Darcy had perceived a difference in the depth of feelings demonstrated by Miss Jane Bennet and Mr. Bingley for each other. He felt that Miss Bennet was not especially interested in or enamoured of Mr. Bingley, whereas he thought that Mr. Bingley was quite seriously affected, which was why he had persuaded Mr. Bingley to leave Netherfield. He did not want his friend to be hurt. Elizabeth also read with astonishment the history of Mr. Wickham, which related to the Darcy family, and which showed him as a conniving opportunist who had been given every consideration by the Darcy family, and had rewarded every member of that family with abuse of their confidence. How differently did everything now appear to Elizabeth in which he was concerned. And Jane? How could she deny credit to his assertions that he'd been totally unsuspicious of her sister's attachment? She had to agree that Jane's feelings, though fervent, were little displayed. She grew absolutely ashamed of herself. Of neither Darcy nor Wickham could she think without feeling that she'd been blind, partial, prejudiced, absurd. Elizabeth's impatience to acquaint Jane with what had happened could no longer be overcome, and preparing her to be surprised, she related to her the next morning the chief of the scene between Mr. Darcy and herself.
His being so sure of succeeding was wrong, and certainly ought not to have appeared. But consider how much it must increase his disappointment.
Indeed. I am heartily sorry for him, but he has other feelings which will probably soon drive away his regard for me. You do not blame me, however, for refusing him.
Blame you? Oh, no.
But you blame me for having spoken so warmly of Wickham.
No, I do not know that you were wrong in saying what you did.
But you will know it when I have told you what happened the very next day.
She then spoke of the letter, repeating the whole of its contents as far as they concerned George Wickham.
I do not know when I have been more shocked. Wickham so very bad. It is almost past belief. And poor Mr. Darcy, oh dear Lizzie, only consider what he must have suffered. Such a disappointment, and with the knowledge of your ill opinion too, and having to relate such a thing. Oh, it really is too distressing. I'm sure you must feel it so.
Oh, no. My regret and compassion are all done away by seeing you so full of both. I know you will do him such ample justice that I am growing every moment more unconcerned and indifferent. Your profusion makes my saving, and if you lament over him much longer, my heart will be as light as a feather.
Poor Wickham! There is such an expression of goodness in his countenance, such an openness and goodness in his manner.
There certainly was some great mismanagement in the education of those two young men. One has got all the goodness, and the other all the appearance of it.
I never thought Mr. Darcy so deficient in the appearance of it as you used to do.
And yet I meant to be uncommonly clever in taking so decided a dislike to him without any reason. It is such a spur to one's genius, such an opening for wit to have a dislike of that kind. One may be continually abusive without saying anything just. But one cannot be always laughing at a man without now and then stumbling on something witty.
Lizzie, when you first read that letter, I'm sure you could not treat the matter as you do now.
Indeed, I could not. I was uncomfortable enough. I was very uncomfortable, I may say unhappy, and with no one to speak to of what I felt. No Jane to comfort me and say that I had not been so very weak and vain and nonsensical as I knew I had. Oh, how I wanted you.
How unfortunate that you should have used such very strong expressions in speaking of Wickham to Mr. Darcy, for now they do appear wholly undeserved.
Certainly, but the misfortune of speaking with bitterness is a most natural consequence of the prejudices I had been encouraging. There is one point on which I want your advice. I want to be told whether I ought or ought not to make our acquaintances in general understand Wickham's character.
Well, surely there can be no occasion for exposing him so dreadfully. What is your own opinion?
That it ought not to be attempted. Mr. Darcy has not authorised me to make his communication public. On the contrary, every particular relative to his family was meant to be kept as much as possible to myself. And if I endeavour to undeceive people as to the rest of his conduct, who will believe me? The general prejudice against Mr. Darcy is so violent that it would be the death of half the good people in Meryton to attempt to place him in an amiable light. I am not equal to it. Wickham will soon be gone, and therefore it will not signify to anybody here what he really is. Some time hence it will all be found out, and then we may laugh at their stupidity in not knowing it before. At present, I will say nothing about it.
You are quite right. To have his errors made public might ruin him forever. He is now perhaps sorry for what he has done, and anxious to re-establish a character. We must not make him desperate.
The first week of their return home was soon gone. The second began. It was the last of Mr. Wickham's regiment's stay in Meryton, and all the young ladies in the neighbourhood were drooping apace. The elder Miss Bennets alone were still able to eat, drink, and sleep. Elizabeth was now to see Mr. Wickham for the last time. On the very last day of the regiment's remaining in Meryton, he dined with others of the officers at Longbourn, and so little was Elizabeth disposed to part from him in good humour that on his making some inquiry as to the manner in which her time has passed at Hunsford, she mentioned Colonel Fitzwilliam and Mr. Darcy having both spent 3 weeks at Rosings, and asked him if he was acquainted with Colonel Fitzwilliam. He looked surprised, displeased, alarmed, but with a moment's recollection and a returning smile, replied that he had formerly seen him often. He then asked,
"How long did you say that he was at Rosings?"
Nearly 3 weeks.
"And you saw him frequently?"
Yes, almost every day.
"His manners are very different from his cousin's."
Yes, very different. But I think Mr. Darcy improves on acquaintance.
"Indeed? And pray may I ask, is it in his address that he approves? Has he deigned to add aught of civility to his ordinary style? For I dare not hope that he has improved in essentials."
Oh, no. In essentials, I believe he is very much what he ever was. When I said that he improved on acquaintance, I did not mean that either his mind or manners were in a state of improvement, but that from knowing him better, his disposition was better understood.
"You, who so well know my feelings towards Mr. Darcy, will readily comprehend how sincerely I must rejoice that he's wise enough to assume even the appearance of what is right."
Elizabeth could not repress a smile at this, but she answered only by a slight inclination of the head. She saw that he wanted to engage her on the old subject of his grievances, and she was in no humour to indulge him. In July, a trip had been planned by the Gardiners where they were to take Lizzie to the lake country. Due to shortage of time, they were obliged to give up the lakes and substitute a more contracted tour which, according to the present plan, was to go no further northward than Derbyshire. In that county there was enough to be seen to occupy the chief of their 3 weeks. With the mention of Derbyshire, there were many ideas connected. It was impossible for Elizabeth to see the word without thinking of Pemberley and its owner, Mr. Darcy. In talking over their route, Mr. Gardiner expressed an inclination to see the very place. Elizabeth was distressed at the idea. She felt that she had no business at Pemberley and was obliged to assume a disinclination for seeing it. To Pemberley, however, they were to go. In Derbyshire, this notion was reinforced. Elizabeth, as they drove along, watched for the first appearance of Pemberley Woods with some perturbation. They descended a hill, crossed a bridge, and drove to the door of the main house. The housekeeper came to meet them. They followed her on a tour of the house. When all the house that was open to general inspection had been seen, they returned downstairs, and taking leave of the housekeeper, were consigned over to the gardener, who met them at the hall door. As they walked across the lawn toward the river, Elizabeth turned back to look again, when the owner of it himself suddenly came forward from the road which led behind into the stables.
Oh, where is my uncle?
Good God, what is the matter?
I am quite well. I am only distressed by some dreadful news which I have just received from Longbourn. I have just had a letter from Jane with such dreadful news. It cannot be concealed from anyone. My younger sister has left all her friends, has eloped, has thrown herself into the power of Mr. Wickham. They are gone off together from Brighton. You know him only too well to doubt the rest. She has no money, no connections, nothing that can tempt him to... She is lost forever. When I considered that I might have prevented it, I who knew what he was, had I but explained some part of it, only some part of what I had learnt to my own family, had his character been known, this could not have happened. But it is all all too late now.
I am grieved indeed. Grieved. Shocked. But is it certain? Absolutely certain?
Oh, yes. They left Brighton together on Sunday night and were traced almost to London, but not beyond. They are certainly not gone to Scotland.
And what has been done? What has been attempted to recover her?
My father is gone to London, and Jane has written to beg my uncle's immediate assistance, and we shall be off, I hope, in half an hour. But nothing can be done. I know very well that nothing can be done. How is such a man to be worked on? How are they even to be discovered? I have not the smallest hope. Oh, it is every way horrible. When my eyes were opened to his real character, oh, had I known what I ought, what I dared to do, but I knew not. I was afraid of doing too much. Oh, wretched, wretched mistake.
I am sorry, very sorry to hear this news. I am afraid you have long desired my absence, nor have I anything to plead in excuse of my stay but real, though unavailing, concern. Would to heaven that anything could be either said or done on my part that might offer consolation to such distress. But I will not torment you with vain wishes, which may seem purposely to ask for your thanks. This unfortunate affair will, I fear, prevent my sisters having the pleasure of seeing you at Pemberley today.
Oh, yes. Be so kind as to apologise for us to Miss Darcy. Say that urgent business calls us home immediately. Conceal the unhappy truth as long as it is possible. I know it cannot be long.
Why, of course. Think of it no more.
Elizabeth was wild to be at home, to hear, to see, to be upon the spot to share with Jane in the cares that must now fall wholly upon her. Had Elizabeth been at leisure to be idle, she would have remained certain that all employment was impossible to one so wretched as herself. But she had her share of business as well as her aunt, and amongst the rest there were notes to be written to all their friends at Lambton with false excuses for their sudden departure. An hour, however, saw the whole completed, and Mr. Gardiner, meanwhile, having settled his account at the inn, nothing remained to be done but go. And Elizabeth, after all the misery of the morning, found herself, in a shorter space of time than she could have supposed, seated in the carriage and on the road to Longbourn. They travelled as expeditiously as possible, and sleeping one night on the road, reached Longbourn by dinner-time the next day.
Is it possible? Can it be possible, as this letter says, that Wickham will indeed marry our Lydia?
Wickham is not so undeserving, then, as we have thought him. Our dear father should be congratulated on the outcome of these latest events.
And may I ask about the terms?
Complied with. Father is only ashamed of Wickham's asking so little.
And they must marry? Oh, yet he is such a man.
Yes, they must marry. There is nothing else to be done. But there are two things that I should very much like to know. One is how much money our uncle has laid down to bring the arrangement about. And the other, how are we ever to pay him?
Money? Our uncle? What do you mean?
Well, it is strange, after all. Wickham has only been promised 100 a year during our father's lifetime, and 50 thereafter.
Well, there are his debts to be discharged. A small sum could not do all this.
Small sum? I have heard £10,000 mentioned.
£10,000? Heaven forbid! How is half such a sum to be repaid? Wickham has not sixpence of his own.
I comfort myself with thinking that he certainly would not marry Lydia if he had not a real regard for her. We must endeavour to forget all that has passed on either side. Their mutual affection will steady them.
Mr. Gardiner wrote again to Mr. Bennet, the principal purport of his letter being to say that Mr. Wickham had resolved on quitting the militia. Lydia's request of being admitted into her family again before setting off for their new home in the north received at first an absolute negative. But Jane and Elizabeth urged their father so earnestly to receive her and her husband at Longbourn as soon as they were married. When Mr. Bennet wrote again to his brother, therefore, he sent his permission for them to come, and it was settled that as soon as the ceremony was over, they should proceed to Longbourn. They came. The family were assembled in the breakfast-room to receive them. Smiles decked the face of Mrs. Bennet as the carriage drove up to the door. Her husband looked impenetrably grave. Her daughters alarmed, anxious, uneasy. Wickham was not at all more distressed than Lydia, but his manners were always so pleasing that had his character and his marriage been exactly what they ought, his smiles and his easy address, while he claimed their relationship, would have delighted them all. During their stay at Longbourn, Lydia let slip some remarks about Mr. Darcy having been involved in the settlement of Mr. Wickham prior to their marriage. Elizabeth became anxious to hear more about this, and wrote to her aunt, Mrs. Gardiner, who confirmed that it was indeed so. Mr. Darcy had arranged for payment of Mr. Wickham's debts, and had made it clear that he would not wish for repayment, and had in fact hoped to keep the whole matter confidential. Elizabeth was humbled, but she was proud of Mr. Darcy, proud that in a cause of compassion and honour he had been able to get the better of himself. She was roused from her seat and her reflections by someone's approach, and before she could strike into another path, she was overtaken by Wickham.
I'm afraid I interrupt your solitary ramble, my dear sister.
You certainly do, but it does not follow that the interruption must be unwelcome.
I should be very sorry indeed if it were. We were always good friends, and now we are better.
True. Are the others coming out?
I do not know. Mrs. Bennet and Lydia are going in the carriage to Meryton. So, my dear sister, I find from our uncle and aunt that you've actually seen Pemberley.
I have.
I almost envy you the pleasure, and yet I believe it would be too much for me. Or else I could take it in on my way to Newcastle. And you saw the old housekeeper, I suppose, poor Reynolds? She was always very fond of me, but of course she didn't mention my name to you.
Yes, she did.
And what did she say?
That you were gone in the army, and she was afraid had not turned out well. At such a distance as that, things are strangely misrepresented.
Certainly. I was surprised to see Darcy in town last month. We passed each other several times. I wonder what he can be doing there.
Perhaps preparing for his marriage with Mr. Berg. It must be something particular to take him there at this time of the year.
Undoubtedly. Did you see him while you were at Lambton? I thought I understood from the gardeners that you had.
Yes. He introduced us to his sister.
And do you like her?
Very much.
I have heard, indeed, that she's uncommonly improved within this year or two. When I last saw her, she wasn't very promising. I'm very glad you liked her. I hope she will turn out well.
I dare say she will. She's got over the most trying age.
Did you go by the village of Kimpton?
I do not recollect that we did.
I mention it because it is the living which I ought to have had. A most delightful place. Excellent parsonage house. It would have suited me in every respect.
How should you have liked making sermons?
Oh, exceedingly well. I should have considered it as part of my duty, and the exertion would soon have been nothing. One ought not to repine, but to be sure it would have been such a thing for me. The quiet, the retirement of such a life would have answered all my ideas of happiness. But it was not to be. Did you ever hear Darcy mention the circumstance when you were in Kent?
I have heard from authority, which I thought is good, that it was left you conditionally only, and at the will of the present patron.
You have? Yes, there was something in that. I told you so from the first, you may remember.
I did hear, too, that there was a time when sermon-making was not so palatable to you as it seems to be at present, that you actually declared your resolution of never taking orders, and that the business had been compromised accordingly.
And it was not wholly without foundation. You may remember what I told you on that point when first we talked of it.
Come, Mr. Wickham, we are brother and sister, you know. Do not let us quarrel about the past. In future, I hope we shall be always of one mind.
She held out her hand. He kissed it with affectionate gallantry, though he hardly knew how to look, and they entered the house. The housekeeper at Netherfield had received orders to prepare for the arrival of her master, who was coming down in a day or two to shoot there for several weeks. Very soon after Mr. Bingley's arrival at Netherfield, he came to call at Longbourn, together with Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth did not know what to make of this, but she still thought him partial to Jane. Elizabeth said as little to either as civility would allow. She ventured only one glance at Darcy. He looked as serious as usual, and, she thought, more as he had looked in Hertfordshire than as she'd seen him at Pemberley. But perhaps he could not in her mother's presence be what he was before her uncle and aunt. It was a painful but not an improbable conjecture. When the gentlemen rose to go away, Mrs. Bennet was mindful of her intended civility, and they were invited and engaged to dine at Longbourn in a few days' time. On Tuesday there was a large party assembled at Longbourn. Elizabeth was in hopes that the evening would afford some opportunity of bringing them together. The gentlemen came, and she thought Mr. Darcy looked as if he would have answered her hopes, but alas, he walked away to another part of the room. After all, she had refused him once. How could she expect a renewal of his love? A few days after this visit, Mr. Bingley called again, and alone.
"'Tis too much, by far too much. I do not deserve it. Oh, why is not everybody as happy? How shall I bear so much happiness? He was totally ignorant of my being in town last spring. I had not believed it possible.
I suspected as much. But how did he account for it?
It must have been his sister's doing. They were certainly no friends to his acquaintance with me, which I cannot wonder at, since he might have chosen so much more advantageously in many respects. But when they see that their brother is happy with me, they will learn to be contented, and we will be on good terms again, though we can never be what we once were to each other.
Oh, that is the most unforgiving speech that I have ever heard you utter. Good girl. It would vex me indeed to see you again the dupe of Miss Bingley's pretended regard.
Would you believe it, Lizzie, that when he went to town last November, he really loved me, and nothing but a persuasion of my being indifferent would have prevented his coming down again.
He made a little mistake, to be sure, but it is to the credit of his modesty.
One morning, about a week after Bingley's engagement with Jane had been formed, a carriage drew up in front of the house. It was Lady Catherine de Bourgh. She entered the house with an air more than usually ungracious, made no other reply to Elizabeth's salutation than a slight inclination of the head, and sat down without saying a word.
"I hope you are well, Miss Bennet. That lady, I suppose, is your mother.
Indeed she is.
And that, I suppose, is one of your sisters.
Yes, madam.
You have a very small park here. This must be a most inconvenient sitting room for the evening in summer. The windows are full west.
May I ask your ladyship whether you left Mr. and Mrs. Collins well?
Yes, very well. I saw them the night before last. Now, Miss Bennet, you can be at no loss to understand the reason of my journey hither. Your own heart, your own conscience must tell you why I came.
Indeed you are mistaken, madam. I have not been at all able to account for the honour of seeing you here.
Miss Bennet, you ought to know that I am not to be trifled with. But however insincere you may choose to be, you shall not find me so. My character has ever been celebrated for its sincerity and frankness, and in a cause of such moment as this, I shall certainly not depart from it. A report of a most alarming nature reached me 2 days ago. I was told that not only your sister was on the point of being most advantageously married, but that Miss Elizabeth Bennet would, in all likelihood, be soon afterwards united to my nephew, my own nephew, Mr. Darcy. Though I know it must be a scandalous falsehood, though I would not injure him so much as to suppose the truth of it possible. I instantly resolved on setting off for this place, that I might make my sentiments known to you.
If you believed it impossible to be true, I wonder you took the trouble of coming so far. What could your ladyship propose by it?
At once to insist upon having such a report universally contradicted.
Your coming to Longbourn to see me and my family will be rather a confirmation of it, if indeed such a report is in existence.
If? Do you then pretend to be ignorant of it? Has it not been industriously circulated by yourselves? Do you not know that such a report is spread abroad?
I never heard that it was.
And can you likewise declare that there is no foundation for it?
I do not pretend to possess equal frankness with your ladyship. You may ask questions, which I shall not choose to answer.
This is not to be borne. Miss Bennet, I insist on being satisfied. Has my nephew made you an offer of marriage?
Your ladyship has declared it to be impossible.
It ought to be so. It must be so, while he retains the use of his reason. But your arts and allurements may, in a moment of infatuation, have made him forget what he owes to himself and to all his family. You may have drawn him in.
If I have, I shall be the last person to confess.
Miss Bennet, do you know who I am? I have not been accustomed to such language as this. I am almost the nearest relation he has in the world. I am entitled to know all his dearest concerns.
But you are not entitled to know mine, nor will such behaviour as this ever induce me to be explicit.
Let me be rightly understood. This match, to which you have the presumption to aspire, can never take place. No, never. Mr. Darcy is engaged to my daughter. Now, what have you to say?
Only this, that if he is so, you can have no reason to suppose he will make an offer to me.
The engagement between my daughter and Mr. Darcy is of a peculiar kind. From their infancy, they have been intended for each other. It was the favourite wish of his mother as well as hers. Now, while in their cradle, we planned the union, and now at the moment when the wishes of both sisters would be accomplished, is their marriage to be prevented by a young woman of inferior birth, of no importance in the world, and wholly unallied to the family? Do you pay no regard to the wishes of his friends, to his tacit engagement with Mr. Burke? Are you lost to every feeling of propriety and delicacy? Have you not heard me say that from his earliest hours he was destined for his cousin?
Yes, and I have heard it before. But what is that to me? If there is no other objection to my marrying your nephew, I shall certainly not be kept from it by knowing that his mother and aunt wished him to marry Mr. Burke. You both did as much as you could in planning the marriage. Its completion depends on others. If Mr. Darcy is neither by honour nor inclination confined to his cousin, why is not he to make another choice? And if I am that choice, why may I not accept him?
Because honour, decorum, prudence, nay, interest forbid it. Yes, Miss Bennet, interest. For do not expect to be noticed by his family or friends. If you wilfully act against the inclinations of all, you will be censured, slighted, and despised by everyone connected with him. Your alliance will be a disgrace. Your name will never, ever be mentioned by any one of us.
These are heavy misfortunes, but the wife of Mr. Darcy must have such extraordinary sources of happiness necessarily attached to her situation that she could, upon the whole, have no cause to repine.
Obstinate, Headstrong girl, I am ashamed of you. Is this your gratitude for my attentions to you last spring? Is nothing due to me on that score? You are to understand, Miss Bennet, that I came here with the determined resolution of carrying my purpose, nor will I be dissuaded from it. I have not been used to submit to any person's whims. I have not been in the habit of brooking disappointment.
That will make your ladyship's situation at present more pitiable, but it will have no effect on me.
I will not be interrupted. Hear me in silence. My daughter and my nephew are formed for each other. They are descended on the maternal side from the same noble line, and on the father's from respectable, honourable and ancient, though untitled, families. Their fortune on both sides is splendid. They are destined for each other by the voice of every member of their respective houses. And what is to divide them? The upstart pretensions of a young woman without family connections or fortune? Is this to be endured? But it must not, shall not be. If you were sensible of your own good, you would not wish to quit the sphere in which you have been brought up.
In marrying your nephew, I should not consider myself as quitting that sphere. He is a gentleman. I am a gentleman's daughter. So far, we are equal.
True, you are a gentleman's daughter. But who was your mother? Who are your uncles and aunts? Do not imagine I am ignorant of their condition.
Whatever my connections may be, if your nephew does not object to them, they can be nothing to you.
Tell me at once and for all, are you engaged to him?
I am not.
And will you promise me never to enter into such an engagement?
I will make no promise of the kind.
Miss Bennet, I am shocked and astonished. I expected to find a more reasonable young woman. But do not deceive yourself into a belief that I will ever recede. I shall not go away till you have given me the assurance I require.
And I certainly never shall give it. I am not to be intimidated into anything so wholly unreasonable. How far your nephew might approve of your interference in his affairs, I cannot tell. But you have certainly no right to concern yourself in mine. I must beg, therefore, to be importuned no farther on the subject.
Not so hasty, if you please. I have by no means done. To all the objections I have already urged, I have still another to add. I am no stranger to the particulars of your young sister's elopement. I know it all. That the young man's marrying her was a patched-up business at the expense of your father and uncles. And is such a girl to be my nephew's sister? Is her husband, is the son of his late father's steward, to be his brother? Heaven and earth! Of what are you thinking? Are the shades of Pemberley to be thus polluted?
You can have nothing further to say. You have insulted me in every possible method.
You have no regard, then, for the honour and credit of my nephew? Unfeeling, selfish girl. Do you not consider that a connection with you must disgrace him in the eyes of everybody?
Lady Catherine, I have nothing farther to say. You know my sentiments.
You are then resolved to have him?
I have said no such thing. I am only resolved to act in that manner which will, in my own opinion, constitute my happiness, without reference to you or to any person so wholly unconnected with me.
I see. You refuse, then, to oblige me. You refuse to obey the claims of duty, honour, gratitude. You are determined to ruin him in the opinion of all his friends and make him the contempt of the world.
Neither duty nor honour nor gratitude has any possible claim on me in the present instance. No principle of either would be violated by my marriage with Mr. Darcy. and with regard to the resentment of his family or the indignation of the world, if the former were excited by his marrying me, it would not give me one moment's concern. And the world in general would have too much sense to join in the scorn.
And this is your real opinion? This is your final resolve? Very well, I shall know how to act. Do not imagine, Miss Bennet, that your ambition will ever be gratified. I came to try you. I hoped to find you reasonable, but depend on it, I will carry my point. I take no leave of you, Miss Bennet. I send no compliments to your mother. You deserve no such attention. I am most seriously displeased.
Lizzie, I have received a letter this morning that has astonished me exceedingly. As it principally concerns yourself, you ought to know its contents. I did not know before that I had 2 daughters on the brink of matrimony. Let me congratulate you on a very important conquest. You look perceptive. Young ladies have great penetration in matters such as these, but I think I may defy even your sagacity to discover the name of your admirer. This letter is from Mr. Collins.
From Mr. Collins? But what can he have to say?
Well, he begins with congratulations on the approaching nuptials of my eldest daughter. What relates to yourself is as follows. Your daughter Elizabeth, it is presumed, will not long bear the name of Bennet after her elder sister has resigned it, and the chosen partner of her fate may be reasonably looked up to as one of the most illustrious persons in this land. Yet let me warn my cousin Elizabeth and yourself of what evils you may incur by a precipitate enclosure with this gentleman's proposals, which of course you will be inclined to take immediate advantage of. My motive for cautioning you is as follows. We have reason to imagine that his aunt, Lady Catherine de Bourgh, does not look on the match with a friendly eye. Mr. Darcy, you see, is the man. Now, Lizzie, I think I have surprised you. Good Mr. Collins or the Lucases have pictured on any man within the circle of our acquaintance whose name would have given the lie more effectively to what they related. Mr. Darcy, who never looks at any woman but to see a blemish, and who probably never looked at you in his life. His perfect indifference and your pointed dislike make it delightfully absurd. The letter concludes, after mentioning the likelihood of this marriage to her ladyship last night, she immediately, and with her usual condescension, expressed what she felt on the occasion, that she would never give her consent to what she termed so disgraceful a match. I thought it my duty to give the speediest intelligence of this to my cousin, that she and her noble admirer may be aware of what they are about, and not run hastily into a marriage which has not been properly sanctioned. Oh dear, much as I abominate writing, I would not give up Mr. Collins' correspondence for any consideration.
Before many days had passed, Mr. Bingley brought Mr. Darcy to Longbourn. They arrived early, and Bingley, who wanted to be alone with Jane, proposed their all walking out. It was agreed to, and before long Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy found themselves lagging behind.
Mr. Darcy, I am a very selfish creature, and for the sake of giving relief to my own feelings, care not how much I may be wounding yours. I can no longer help thanking you for your unexampled kindness to my poor sister. Ever since I have known it, I have been most anxious to acknowledge to you how gratefully I feel it. Were it known to the rest of my family, I should not have merely my own gratitude to express.
If you will thank me, let it be for yourself alone. That the wish of giving happiness to you might add force to the other inducements which led me on, I shall not attempt to deny. But your family owe me nothing. Much as I respect them, I believe I thought only of you. If your feelings are still what they were last April, tell me so at once. My affection and wishes are unchanged, but one word from you will silence me on this subject forever. When I learnt of my aunt's visit to Longbourn, it taught me to hope as I had scarcely ever allowed myself to hope before, I knew enough of your disposition to be certain that, had you been absolutely, irrevocably decided against me, you would have acknowledged it to Lady Catherine frankly and openly.
Yes, you know enough of my frankness to believe me capable of that. After abusing you so vehemently to your face, I could have no scruple in abusing you to all your relations.
My behaviour to you at the time merited the severest reproof. It was unpardonable. I cannot think of it without abhorrence.
Oh, we will not quarrel for the greater share of blame annexed to that evening. But since then, we have both, I hope, improved in civility.
I cannot be so easily reconciled to myself. The recollection of what I then said, of my conduct, my manners, my expressions during the whole of it, is now, and has been for many months, inexpressibly painful to me. Your reproof, so well applied, I shall never forget. Had you behaved in a more gentlemanlike manner. Those were your words. You know not, you can scarcely conceive how they have tortured me, though it was some time, I confess, before I was reasonable enough to allow their justice.
I was certainly very far from expecting them to make so strong an impression.
I can easily believe it. You thought me then devoid of every proper feeling. I am sure you did. The turn of your countenance I shall never forget, as you said that I could not have addressed you any possible way that would induce you to accept me.
Oh, do not repeat what I then said. These recollections will not do at all. I assure you that I have long been most heartily ashamed of it.
And my letter, did it? Did it soon make you think better of me? I knew that what I wrote must give pain, but it was necessary. I can remember some expressions which might justly make you hate me. When I wrote that letter, I believed myself perfectly calm and cool, but I am since convinced that it was written in a dreadful bitterness of spirit.
The letter perhaps began in bitterness, but it did not end so. The adieu is charity itself. I think no more of it. The feelings of the person who wrote it and the person who received it are now so widely different from what they were then that every unpleasant circumstance attending it ought to be forgotten. You must learn some of my philosophy. Think only of the past, as its remembrance gives you pleasure.
I cannot give you credit for any philosophy of the kind. Your retrospection is totally void of reproach. But with me, it is not so. Painful recollections will intrude, which ought not to be repelled. I have been a selfish being all my life, in practice, though not in principle. As a child, I was taught what was right, but I was not taught to correct my temper. I was given good principles, but left to follow them in pride and conceit. Unfortunately, an only son, I was spoilt by my parents, who also taught me to be selfish and overbearing, to care for none beyond my own family circle, to think meanly of all the rest of the world. Such I was from 8 to 28, and such I might have been but for you, dearest, loveliest Elizabeth. What do I not owe you? You taught me a lesson, hard indeed at first, but most advantageous. By you I was properly humbled. I came to you without a doubt of my reception. I believed you to be wishing, expecting my addresses.
My manners must have been at fault, but not intentionally, I assure you. I never meant to deceive you, but my spirits might often lead me wrong. How you must have hated me after that evening.
Hates you? I was angry, perhaps, at first, but my anger soon began to take a proper direction.
I am almost afraid of asking you what you thought of me when we met at Pemberley. You blamed me for coming?
No, indeed. I felt nothing but surprise.
Your surprise could not be greater than mine in being noticed by you. My conscience told me that I deserved no extraordinary politeness, and I confess that I did not expect to receive more than my due.
My object then was to show you by every civility in my power that I was not so mean as to resent the past. And I hoped to obtain your forgiveness, to lessen your ill opinion, by letting you see that your reproofs had been attended to. How soon any other wishes introduced themselves, I can hardly tell, but I believe in about half an hour after I had seen you.
You are joking, Lizzie. This cannot be. Engaged to Mr. Darcy? No, you shall not deceive me. I know it to be impossible.
Oh, this is a wretched beginning indeed. My sole dependence was on you, and I am sure no one else will believe me if you do not. Yes, indeed, I am in earnest. I speak nothing but the truth. He still loves me, and we are engaged.
Oh, Lizzie, it cannot be. I know how much you dislike him.
You know nothing of the matter. That is all to be forgot. Perhaps I did not always love him so well as I do now. But in such cases as these, a good memory is unpardonable. This is the last time I shall ever remember it myself.
Good heaven! Can it really be so? Yet now I must believe you. Oh, my dear, dear Lizzie, I do congratulate you, but are you certain? Forgive the question, but are you certain that you can be happy with him?
There can be no doubt of that. It is settled between us already that we are to be the happiest couple in the world. But are you pleased, Jane? Shall you like to have such a brother?
Oh, very, very much. Nothing could give Bingley or myself more delight. Oh, Lizzie, are you quite sure that you feel what you ought to?
Oh, yes. You will only think I feel more than I ought to when I tell you all.
What do you mean?
Why, I must confess that I love him better than I do Bingley. Oh, I'm afraid you will be angry.
My dearest sister, now do be serious. I want to talk very seriously. Let me know everything that I am to know without delay. Will you tell me how long you have loved him?
Oh, it has been coming on so gradually that I hardly know when it began. But I believe I must date it from my first seeing his beautiful grounds at Pemberley.
Now I am quite happy, for you will be as happy as myself. I always had a value for him. Were it for nothing but his love for you, I must always have esteemed him. But now, as Bingley's friend and your husband, there can be only Bingley and yourself more dear to me. Oh, but Lizzie, you have been very sly, very reserved with me.
I wonder what Papa will say. Mr. Darcy is to speak to him this evening.
Lizzie, what are you doing? Are you out of your senses to be accepting this man? Have you not always hated him?
Have you any other objection than your belief of my indifference?
None at all. We all know him to be a proud, unpleasant sort of man. But this would be nothing if you rarely liked him.
I do. I do like him. I love him.
Well, my dear, I have not more to say. If this be the case, he deserves you. I could not have parted with you, my Lizzie, to anyone less worthy.
Elizabeth had the satisfaction of seeing her father taking pains to get acquainted with Mr. Darcy, and obviously succeeding. Later, outside, near the pleasantly playing fountain in the gardens, Elizabeth wanted Mr. Darcy to account for his having ever fallen in love with her.
How could you begin? I can comprehend your going on charmingly when you had once made a beginning, but what could set you off in the first place?
I cannot fix on the hour, or the spot, or the look, or the words which laid the foundation. It is too long ago. I was in the middle before I knew that I had begun.
Now be sincere. Did you admire me for my impertinence?
For the liveliness of your mind, I did.
You may as well call it impertinence at once. The fact is that you were sick of civility, of deference, of officious attention. You were disgusted with the women who were always speaking and looking and thinking for your approbation alone. I roused and interested you because I was so unlike them. There. I have saved you the trouble of accounting for it, and really, all things considered, I begin to think it perfectly reasonable. To be sure, you know no actual good of me, but nobody thinks of that when they fall in love.
Was there no good in your affectionate behaviour to Jane while she was ill at Netherfield?
Oh, dearest Jane, who could have done less for her? But make a virtue of it by all means. My good qualities are under your protection, and you are to exaggerate them as much as possible. And in return it belongs to me to find occasions for teasing and quarrelling with you as often as may be. And I shall begin directly by asking you, what made you so unwilling to come to the point at last?
Because you were grave and silent and gave me no encouragement.
But I was embarrassed.
And so was I.
You might have talked to me more when you came to dinner.
A man who had felt less might.
I wonder how long you would have gone on if you had been left to yourself. My resolution of thanking you for your kindness to Lydia had certainly great effect. Too much, I am afraid.
You need not distress yourself. Lady Catherine's unjustifiable endeavours to separate us were the means of removing all my doubts. I am not indebted for my present happiness to your eager desire of expressing your gratitude. I was not in a humour to wait for an opening of yours. My aunt's intelligence had given me hope, and I was determined at once to know everything.
Shall you ever have courage to announce to Lady Catherine what is to befall her?
I am more likely to want time than courage, Elizabeth. But it ought to be done. And if you will give me a sheet of paper when we go back into the house, it shall be done directly.
And if I had not a letter to write myself, I might sit by you and admire the evenness of your writing, as another young lady once did. But I have my aunt, too, who must not be longer neglected.
And so, in a flurry of penmanship, all announcements and declarations were made, as a result of which Miss Bingley was deeply mortified by Darcy's marriage, but as she thought it advisable to retain the right of visiting at Pemberley, she dropped all her resentment, was fonder than ever of Georgiana Darcy, almost as attentive to Darcy as heretofore, and paid off every arrear of civility to Elizabeth. Miss Bingley's congratulations to her brother on his approaching marriage were all that was affectionate and insincere. The joy with which Georgiana Darcy expressed on receiving similar information about her brother was as sincere as her brother's in sending it. 4 sides of paper were insufficient to contain all her delight and all her earnest desire of being loved by her sister. Before any answer could arrive from Mr. Collins, or any congratulations to Elizabeth from his wife, the Longbourn family heard that the Collinses were come themselves to Lucas Lodge. The reason of this sudden removal was soon evident. Lady Catherine had been rendered so exceedingly angry by the contents of her nephew's letter that Charlotte, really rejoicing in the match, was anxious to get away till the storm was blown over. Georgiana, Darcy's sister, had the highest opinion in the world of Elizabeth, though at first she often listened with an astonishment bordering on alarm at Elizabeth's lively, sportive manner of talking to her brother. Lady Catherine was extremely indignant on the marriage of her nephew, and as she gave way to all the genuine frankness of her character, in her reply to his letter she sent him language so very abusive, especially of Elizabeth, that for some time intercourse was at an end. Happy for all her maternal feelings was the day on which Mrs. Bennet got rid of her 2 most deserving daughters. With what delighted pride she afterwards visited Mrs. Bingley and talked of Mrs. Darcy may be guessed. Though Darcy could never receive Wickham at Pemberley, yet for Elizabeth's sake he assisted him further in his profession. Lydia was occasionally a visitor there when her husband was gone to enjoy himself in London or Bath, and with the Bingleys they both of them frequently stayed so long that even Bingley's good humour was overcome, and he proceeded so far as to talk of giving them a hint to be gone. Mr. Bennet missed his second daughter exceedingly. His affection for her drew him oftener from home than anything else could do. He delighted in going to Pemberley, especially when he was least expected.
When daisies pied and violets blue, and lady smocks all silver white, and cocoa balls on yellow hue, do paint the meadows with delight.